This iceberg catalogs belief systems by familiarity and obscurity. Placement is not a judgment of truth or legitimacy. Some entries involve disturbing or extremist material. Viewer discretion is advised. Timestamps are provided below. Sabianism is one of those rare religious traditions that managed to secure divine protection in the Quran itself, yet almost nobody today can agree on who the Sabians actually were. The Quran mentions them 3 times alongside Christians and Jews as people of the book, granting them a protected status under Islamic law. That single detail has fueled centuries of debate, identity claims, and outright theological fraud. The most commonly accepted candidates are the Mandeans, a Gnostic sect still surviving in parts of Iraq and Iran who practice ritual baptism and revere John the Baptist, but notably reject Jesus and Abraham. Their religion predates Islam by centuries, and their sacred texts are written in a dialect of Aramaic. They've historically claimed the Sabian label, and many scholars back them up. But there's a second group that muddies the waters considerably. In the city of Harran, in what is now southeastern Turkey, a community of pagan star worshippers existed well into the Islamic period. When the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun passed through around 830 CE, he allegedly confronted the Harranians and demanded they convert to an accepted religion or face consequences. According to the story, a quick-thinking legal advisor told them to simply call themselves Sabians, since nobody could definitively prove they weren't. And it worked. The Harranian Sabians then operated under this borrowed identity for generations, openly practicing a form of Hellenistic astral religion that drew from Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and ancient Mesopotamian star worship. They built temples to planetary deities, performed elaborate rituals timed to celestial events, and produced some of the Islamic world's most accomplished astronomers and mathematicians, including Thabit ibn Qurra. So you have this bizarre situation where a Quranic label meant to protect a monotheistic community was essentially hijacked by a group of philosophical pagans, and both groups operated under the same name simultaneously for centuries. Medieval Islamic scholars were fully aware of this confusion and spilled enormous amounts of ink trying to sort out which Sabians were the real ones. The Harranian branch eventually disappeared around the 11th century, but the Mandeans persist to this day, though their numbers have dwindled dramatically due to the Iraq War and subsequent regional instability. Their population, once estimated around 60 to 70,000 in Iraq, has scattered across the globe as refugees. The legacy of Sabianism is essentially a masterclass in how a single ambiguous word in a holy text can create centuries of theological loopholes, borrowed identities, and genuine confusion that scholars still haven't fully untangled.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.
Thomasines were an early Christian community who believed they had access to the real teachings of Jesus, not through Peter or Paul, but through the Apostle Thomas. And not the version of Thomas you were probably taught about in Sunday school. Most people know Thomas as Doubting Thomas, the apostle who refused to believe Jesus had risen from the dead until he could physically touch the wounds himself. That reputation comes straight from the Gospel of John, and it's not exactly flattering. But the Thomasines saw this completely differently. To them, Thomas wasn't some stubborn skeptic lagging behind the other disciples. He was the one Jesus trusted with his deepest, most secret teachings, the stuff that wasn't meant for general audiences. Their core text was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. No narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion story. Just raw, unfiltered statements, many of which overlap with the canonical Gospels, but others that go in wildly different directions. One saying suggests that the kingdom of God isn't a place you go when you die. It's already spread across the earth, and people simply fail to see it. Another implies that salvation comes not through faith or ritual, but through understanding yourself at a fundamental level. The Thomasines likely emerged in the region of Edessa, in what is now southeastern Turkey, possibly as early as the 1st or 2nd century. Edessa became one of the earliest centers of Christianity outside the Roman Empire, and Thomas held a status there that rivaled Peter's authority in Rome. Local tradition held that Thomas himself had traveled through the region on his way to India, and that his bones were eventually brought back and enshrined in Edessa. What set the Thomasines apart from mainstream Christianity was their emphasis on gnosis, direct, personal knowledge of the divine. rather than organized hierarchy or creedal belief. This put them squarely at odds with the version of Christianity that eventually won out. As the institutional church consolidated power and standardized its scriptures, texts like the Gospel of Thomas were excluded, copied less and less, and eventually buried, in some cases literally. The most complete surviving copy was found in 1945 in a sealed jar near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, alongside dozens of other texts that the early church had worked very hard to suppress. The Thomasines didn't survive as a distinct group, but their ideas kept resurfacing in various forms throughout history. Every time someone argues that the institutional church drifted from the original message of Jesus, or that there's a hidden spiritual tradition beneath the surface of organized religion, they're walking a path the Thomasines carved out nearly 2,000 years ago. Millerism was a 19th century American religious movement built almost entirely around one man's math, and one very specific prediction. William Miller, a Baptist preacher from upstate New York, spent years poring over the Book of Daniel and concluded that he had cracked the code for the exact date of Christ's return. His calculation pointed to sometime around 1843 or 1844, and he wasn't shy about telling people. What started as a local curiosity snowballed into a full-blown national phenomenon. By the early 1840s, Miller had attracted somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000 followers across the United States. Newspapers ran his predictions. Traveling lecturers spread the message. People sold their homes, gave away their possessions, and settled their debts because they genuinely believed the world was about to end. The movement went through several revised dates as each one passed without incident, but the big one, October 22, 1844, became the final stand. Followers gathered on hilltops and in meeting halls, some reportedly wearing white ascension robes, waiting to be taken up. When midnight came and went with nothing but silence, the fallout was devastating. This event became known as the Great Disappointment, which is honestly one of the most brutally accurate names in religious history. Thousands abandoned the movement overnight. Some returned to their original churches humiliated. Others fell into deep despair, having given up everything for a date on a calendar. But Millerism fractured. Several splinter groups emerged from the wreckage, each offering a different explanation for why the prediction failed. Some said the date was right, but the event was spiritual rather than physical. Others recalculated entirely. These splinter groups eventually gave rise to some very well-known denominations, most notably the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which today claims over 25 million members worldwide. So a failed doomsday prediction from a farmer in New York didn't kill the movement. It just forced it to evolve. The Yellow Sand Society, also known as the Yellow Way Society or Yellow Gate Society, operated across northern China from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century. This rural secret society combined folk religion with armed resistance, launching multiple uprisings against the Qing Empire, the Republic of China, and eventually Japanese occupation forces. The group emerged during the gradual collapse of Qing dynasty authority, when banditry and lawlessness swept through isolated rural areas along the borders of Henan, Shandong, and Hebei provinces. Peasant communities banded together for protection, but the Yellow Sands took this further by incorporating millenarian beliefs and ritual practices that promised members supernatural protection. Their fighters carried yellow flags emblazoned with their leaders' names and performed incantations they believed would make them invulnerable to bullets, mixing Taoist and Buddhist elements into their own syncretic belief system. In 1908, peasants in eastern Henan formally organized themselves as the Yellow Way Society in direct opposition to the Qing government. 3 years later, they launched an open rebellion to support the Xinhai Revolution, capturing and plundering the city of Taikang before being defeated with roughly 1,000 members eliminated in the fighting. Around 1919, things got particularly interesting when a man calling himself Chu the Ninth appeared in northern Henan, claiming to be the 9th-generation descendant of the Ming dynasty. With support from a local Yellow Way teacher, he proclaimed himself Emperor of China under the era name Great Brightness. The two jointly declared that only Yellow Way Society members would be spared in the coming end times, launching an insurgency that lasted 3 years before Republican militia forces finally shut it down. The society continued operations throughout the warlord era, organizing rural communities to resist increasing taxation and government interference. In 1927, they joined forces with other secret societies like the Red Spears and Heavenly Gates to capture Chang'an County, running the local government for several months. Though they fought the same warlord enemies as the nationalist Kuomintang, the new government viewed them with suspicion, fearing they would interfere with tax collection just as they had resisted previous regimes. When Japanese forces occupied Chinese territory during the 1930s, the Yellow Sand Society participated in resistance efforts. One branch reorganized itself as the People's Anti-Japanese National Salvation Self-Defense Corps, operating from Taocheng in southern Hebei. Japanese troops actively suppressed Yellow Sand members in occupied zones, particularly after the Tengu Truce established demilitarized areas. The Chinese Communist Party systematically dismantled the Yellow Sand Society and other secret societies after 1949 through raids, interrogations, public trials, and re-education campaigns. The withdrawal from the sex movement between 1951 and 1953 forced members to publicly renounce their affiliations, while ongoing anti-superstition drives during the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution eliminated any remaining traces of the organization by the late 1950s. The Douay-Rheims only movement is essentially the Catholic equivalent of the King James only crowd in Protestant circles, but with its own distinct flavor of theological stubbornness. The Douay-Rheims Bible is an English translation produced by Catholic scholars in the late 1500s and early 1600s, translated directly from the Latin Vulgate rather than from the original Hebrew and Greek texts. The New Testament portion was completed in 1582 at the English College in Reims, France, and the Old Testament followed in 1609 at the University of Douay in what is now northern France. For centuries, this was the English Bible for Catholics, and it held that position largely unchallenged until the mid-20th century. The movement really picks up steam as a reaction to the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, which opened the door for newer Catholic Bible translations like the New American Bible and the Jerusalem Bible. For adherents of this movement, those modern translations are more than just unnecessary. They're viewed as corrupted, watered down, and theologically compromised by Protestant and modernist influence. The core argument goes something like this. The Latin Vulgate was declared the authentic Bible of the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent in 1546. Since the Douay-Rheims translates directly from the Vulgate, it carries a level of ecclesiastical authority that no modern translation can claim. Newer translations that go back to the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts are, in their view, actually moving further away from the church-approved text, not closer to accuracy. This movement tends to overlap heavily with traditionalist Catholic circles, particularly groups like the Society of St. Pius X and various Sedevacantist communities who already reject most post-Vatican II changes. For them, clinging to the Douay-Rheims isn't just a preference, it's a theological statement about the entire direction of the modern Catholic Church. One interesting wrinkle is that the version most of these advocates actually use isn't even the original Douay-Rheims. It's the 1749 revision by Bishop Richard Challoner, which was so heavily updated that some scholars argue it's practically a separate translation. So the pure, unchanged Bible they're defending has already been substantially revised, which is a detail most proponents tend to gloss over. The movement remains relatively small but vocal, primarily thriving in online traditionalist Catholic forums and among independent chapel communities that operate outside mainstream diocesan structures. The Greek Catholic Church of Croatia and Serbia is one of those religious bodies that exists in a fascinating gray zone between Eastern and Western Christianity. These are communities that follow Byzantine liturgical traditions. Think Eastern Orthodox style worship with icons, chanting, and the divine liturgy. But they answer to the Pope in Rome rather than an Orthodox patriarch. The roots of this church trace back to the Union of Marcha in 1611, when a group of Orthodox Serbs living in the Croatian military frontier accepted communion with Rome. The deal was essentially this: keep your Eastern rites, keep your married clergy, keep your Julian calendar, but recognize papal authority. For the communities involved, it was partly a spiritual decision and partly a survival strategy, since Catholics held significantly more rights and protections under Habsburg rule than Orthodox Christians did. Over the centuries, This created a population that didn't quite fit anywhere. Orthodox Serbs often viewed them as traitors who sold out their heritage for political advantage. Roman Catholics sometimes looked at them as not quite Catholic enough, and the communities themselves developed a distinct identity caught between two worlds, ethnically tied to Serbian or Croatian heritage, liturgically Eastern, but jurisdictionally Western. The Church went through dramatic upheaval during the 20th century. Under the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, pressures mounted from both Serbian Orthodox and Roman Catholic sides. Then during World War II, the situation became even more volatile, with forced conversions and political manipulation of religious identity becoming tools of the various warring factions in the Balkans. After the war, the communist Yugoslav government suppressed religious institutions broadly, but Eastern Catholics had an especially difficult time since they were a small minority without a powerful protector. The Church survived in scattered parishes, often barely holding on. Today, the Krzewski Eparchy, named after the Croatian city of Krzewski, serves as the primary diocese for this community. It's one of the smallest Eastern Catholic churches in the world, with only a few tens of thousands of faithful spread across Croatia, Serbia, and diaspora communities. Their bishop oversees a flock that most people don't even know exists, practicing a form of Christianity that is simultaneously ancient and perpetually caught in an identity crisis that has lasted over 400 years. The Zaire Use is a special variation of the Catholic Mass that the Vatican officially approved in 1988, and it is one of the only liturgical rites in the entire Roman Catholic Church that openly incorporates African cultural traditions directly into the ceremony. We're talking dancing during worship, rhythmic singing, congregational call and response, and an announcer who essentially hypes up the crowd at key moments throughout the service. If you walked into one of these masses expecting a quiet, traditional Catholic experience, you'd be in for a surprise. Officially called the Roman Missal for the Diocese of Zaire, which is the former name of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this rite came out of the Second Vatican Council's push in the 1960s to allow local cultural adaptations in how Mass is celebrated around the world. But the Zaire Use went further than most. The congregation sits during the reading of the Gospel, which is the opposite of standard Catholic practice. Worshippers are explicitly invited to raise their hands during the Lord's Prayer, and the entire structure of the Mass includes added responses from the congregation, turning what is typically a priest-led ritual into something far more communal and interactive. The political backdrop is just as fascinating. Zairean President Mobutu Sese Seko was running a national campaign he called Authenticity, which was all about purging Western cultural influence from the country. Under his pressure, a 1975 synod of the Congolese bishops decided to move the celebration of various Western saint feast days off the weekly calendar and consolidate them onto Sundays instead. The Church was essentially being squeezed from both sides, needing to satisfy the Vatican's requirements while adapting to a political leader who saw Western Christianity as a form of cultural colonization. The rite stayed relatively obscure for decades until December 2019, when Pope Francis himself celebrated Mass using the Zaire Use at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, marking the 25th anniversary of the first Congolese Catholic chaplaincy in the city. That moment put it back in the global spotlight and reignited debate within Catholic circles about how far enculturation, the process of blending local culture with church liturgy, should be allowed to go. Critics argued that incorporating rhythmic dance and celebratory music into the most sacred act of Catholic worship blurred the line between religious devotion and cultural performance. Supporters countered that rigid adherence to European liturgical norms was itself a form of cultural imposition that had nothing to do with the actual theology. Either way, the Zaire Use stands as one of the most radical experiments in adapting one of the world's oldest religious institutions to a completely different cultural context, and it remains in use in parts of Central Africa to this day. The Syro-Malankara Catholic Church is one of those religious bodies that exists because of a reunion that took almost 2,000 years to happen. This is an Eastern Catholic church based primarily in Kerala, India, and its roots trace all the way back to the Apostle Thomas himself, who according to tradition arrived on the southwestern coast of India around 52 AD and established Christian communities there long before most of Europe had even heard the gospel. For centuries, these Indian Christians developed their own distinct liturgical traditions, using Syriac as their sacred language and following worship practices that would look completely foreign to anyone sitting in a Roman Catholic pew. They swung incense in ways that mirrored the ancient churches of Antioch, chanted in a dialect of Aramaic, and maintained a hierarchy that operated independently from Rome. The real twist came in the 1500s, when Portuguese colonizers showed up in India and were genuinely shocked to find Christians already there. Rather than leaving them alone, the Portuguese attempted to forcibly Latinize these communities, stripping away their Eastern traditions and dragging them under direct Roman authority. This went about as well as you'd expect, and it triggered a series of splits and factional disputes that fragmented the St. Thomas Christian community into multiple competing churches over the following centuries. The Syro-Malankara Catholic Church specifically formed in 1930, when a bishop named Gevarghese Ivanios led a group from the Malankara Orthodox tradition back into communion with Rome. The key detail here is that Rome actually agreed to let them keep their Eastern liturgical practices intact. They use the West Syriac Rite, their priests can be married, and their worship incorporates traditions that predate most of what Western Christians would recognize as standard church practice. Today, the church has roughly 500,000 members, most still concentrated in Kerala, and it operates under its own major archbishop, rather than answering directly to a Latin Rite bishop. It sits in this fascinating middle ground, fully Catholic and in union with the Pope, but practicing a form of Christianity that in many ways feels closer to the Orthodox and Oriental churches than to anything you'd find in Rome. The Armenian Catholic Church is one of those branches of Christianity that exists because of a centuries-long tug-of-war between Eastern tradition and Roman authority. This is a fully recognized Catholic Church, meaning it accepts the Pope as its spiritual leader, but it operates with its own distinct liturgy, its own hierarchy, and its own cultural identity rooted in Armenian Christianity, one of the oldest Christian traditions on the planet. To understand how this church came to be, you need to know that Armenia was the first nation to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion, all the way back in 301 AD. For over 1,000 years, the Armenian Apostolic Church operated independently, but starting around the time of the Crusades in the 12th century, some Armenian Christians began forming closer ties with Rome. Armenian monks and clergy in places like Cilicia, a medieval Armenian kingdom in what is now southern Turkey, started accepting papal authority while keeping their Armenian rites and traditions. The formal establishment of the Armenian Catholic Church as its own entity really solidified in the 18th century when a monk named Abraham Ardzivian was elected as the first patriarch of Cilicia for Armenian Catholics in 1742, with official recognition from Pope Benedict XIV. This created a permanent split within the Armenian Christian community, those who stayed with the original Apostolic Church and those who aligned with Rome. The church uses the Armenian Rite, which means services are conducted in classical Armenian. The liturgical calendar follows ancient Armenian traditions, and the aesthetics of worship look and sound distinctly different from a Roman Catholic Mass. Priests in the Armenian Catholic Church are even allowed to be married if they were married before ordination, a practice that would be unthinkable in the Latin Rite, but is perfectly standard here. Today, the Armenian Catholic Church has around 750,000 members scattered across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and diaspora communities worldwide. Its spiritual headquarters, the Patriarchate, is based in Beirut, Lebanon, after being relocated multiple times due to the Armenian genocide and the broader instability of the region. It's a church that has survived empire collapses, forced migrations, and near-extinction events, and still maintains a unique identity that is somehow both fully Catholic and fully Armenian at the same time. The 5% Nation, also known as the Nation of Gods and Earths, is a movement that broke away from the Nation of Islam in 1964, founded by a man named Clarence 13X in Harlem, New York. Clarence, a former student of Malcolm X, developed his own interpretation of the Nation of Islam's teachings and took them in a radically different direction. The core belief system divides humanity into 3 categories. 85% of people are the deaf, dumb, and blind masses who are easily led and manipulated. 10% are the elite who know the truth, but use it to control and exploit the 85%. And the remaining 5% are the poor righteous teachers who know the truth and are dedicated to enlightening everyone else. That's where the name comes from. But the real centerpiece of 5%er theology is the idea that the black man is literally God. Not a metaphor, not symbolic. They teach that every black man is the physical embodiment of the divine, referred to as God or Allah. Black women are called earths, understood as the foundation of civilization, much like the planet itself sustains life. Their teachings are built around something called the supreme mathematics and the supreme alphabet, two systems that assign deeper philosophical meanings to numbers and letters. The number 7, for example, represents God. The letter B stands for be or born. Followers use these systems to decode hidden truths in everyday language, names, and even current events. It functions almost like a cipher, a lens through which everything in the world can be reinterpreted. 5%ers don't consider themselves a religion. They reject organized religion entirely, calling it a tool of the 10% used to control the masses. There are no churches, no formal clergy, no official membership roles. Teaching happens through informal study circles called ciphers, where members break down lessons and build knowledge collectively. Where the 5% nation left arguably its biggest mark is in hip-hop. The movement's influence on rap music from the late 1980s onward is enormous. Wu-Tang Clan, Brand Nubian, Busta Rhymes, Rakim, J Electronica, and many others either directly identified as 5%ers or heavily incorporated the language and philosophy into their music. Terms like dropping science, word is bond, and peace god that became staples of hip-hop vocabulary trace directly back to 5%er culture. The FBI monitored the movement for decades, classifying it at various points as a potential threat. Several state prison systems have gone back and forth on whether to recognize it as a legitimate religious group or ban its literature entirely. In 2014, a federal court in Virginia actually ruled that the 5% nation could not be classified as a religion, which, ironically, is exactly what its members had been saying all along. Shugendo is a Japanese spiritual practice built on one core idea, that enlightenment is earned through suffering in the mountains. Not metaphorical suffering either. We're talking barefoot climbs through freezing terrain, standing under ice-cold waterfalls for hours, and fasting on remote peaks, where a single wrong step means you're not coming back down. The tradition dates back to at least the 7th century, and is attributed to a figure named Enno Gyoja, a mystic who was reportedly exiled by the Japanese emperor for having too much spiritual influence over the people. According to legend, Enno Gyoja could command demons and spirits, and he laid the groundwork for what would become an entire class of mountain ascetics known as Yamabushi, literally meaning those who lie down in the mountains. Yamabushi occupy this fascinating gray zone in Japanese religion. Shugendo itself is technically a blend of esoteric Buddhism, Shinto, Taoism, and indigenous folk beliefs, which made it a target during the Meiji Restoration in 1872 when the Japanese government tried to cleanly separate Buddhism and Shinto. Shugendo didn't fit neatly into either box, so the government simply banned it outright. The practice was forced underground for decades and wasn't officially permitted again until after World War II. The Yamabushi training regimen is genuinely extreme. Initiates on sacred mountains like Omani and Haguro undergo multi-day ordeals called arafuri that are designed to simulate death and rebirth. One of the more intense rituals involves being dangled headfirst over the edge of a cliff by your ankles while being asked to confess your wrongdoings. If your answers aren't satisfactory, they pretend to let go. It's essentially a trust fall designed by someone who thought regular trust falls were for cowards. The practitioners believe that by pushing the human body to its absolute limit in nature, they can access supernatural abilities called genriki. These include things like firewalking, healing the sick, and exorcising malevolent spirits. To this day, Yamabushi firewalking ceremonies are still performed publicly at temples across Japan, and they remain one of the few points where mainstream Japanese society interacts with this otherwise reclusive tradition. Shugendo never fully recovered from its decades-long ban, and the number of practicing Yamabushi has steadily declined. But small communities still carry out the old mountain rituals, dressed in their distinctive checked robes and carrying conch shell horns called horogai, whose blasts echo through the valleys as they have for over 1,000 years. The Dalit Buddhism movement is one of the largest mass religious conversions in modern history, and it was orchestrated as an act of deliberate social rebellion. To understand it, you need to know about the caste system in India. For thousands of years, Hindu society operated under a rigid hierarchy where your birth determined your social standing for life. At the very bottom sat the Dalits, formerly called untouchables, a group so low on the ladder they were technically considered beneath the caste system entirely. Dalits were forced into the most degrading labor, barred from sharing wells or temples with higher castes, and in many communities, even their shadows were considered polluting. We're talking about roughly 1 in 6 people in India living under these conditions, generation after generation, with religious scripture being cited as the justification. Enter B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit who against all odds became one of the most educated men in India, earning degrees from Columbia University and the London School of Economics. He went on to draft India's constitution and spent decades fighting the caste system through legal and political channels. But by the 1950s, Ambedkar had come to a conclusion that shocked the establishment. He declared that Hinduism itself was the problem, and that no amount of reform from within could dismantle a system so deeply embedded in the religion's framework. On October 14, 1956, in Nagpur, Ambedkar publicly converted to Buddhism alongside an estimated 500,000 followers in a single ceremony. He chose Buddhism specifically because it rejected the concept of caste, originated in India, and carried a legacy of egalitarianism. He also took 22 vows that day, which his followers repeated after him, explicitly renouncing Hindu beliefs and committing to Buddhist principles. One of those vows literally states, "I do not and shall not believe that Lord Buddha was the incarnation of Vishnu," directly severing the tie Hinduism had tried to maintain with Buddhism for centuries. Ambedkar passed away just weeks later, but the movement he ignited didn't stop. Millions more Dalits converted in the decades that followed, and today, Navayana Buddhism, meaning new vehicle, is practiced by tens of millions across India. It's distinct from traditional Buddhist schools because it downplays the monastic and meditative aspects in favor of social justice, anti-caste activism, and community empowerment. The Indian government and Hindu nationalist groups have had a complicated relationship with the movement, to put it mildly. Conversion has been a politically charged topic in India for a long time, and several states have passed freedom of religion laws that, despite their name, actually make it harder to convert away from Hinduism. Critics argue these laws exist specifically to slow movements like Dalit Buddhism. The whole thing functions as a case study in religion, being used not just as spiritual practice, but as a deliberate tool of political and social liberation, where leaving one faith for another was itself the act of protest. The Hebrew Roots movement is a Christian religious movement that seeks to reclaim what followers believe are the original Jewish practices of the earliest church. Beginning in the 1970s and gaining significant momentum through the internet age, this movement attracts believers who feel mainstream Christianity has strayed too far from its Jewish foundations. Members observe the seventh-day Sabbath from Friday evening to Saturday evening, following the same schedule as Orthodox Jews. They celebrate biblical festivals like Passover, Sukkot, and Yom Kippur, while rejecting Christmas and Easter as pagan-influenced holidays that have no scriptural basis. Many followers refuse to even acknowledge December 25th, viewing Constantine's merger of Christianity with Roman sun worship as a corruption that continues today. The movement insists on using Hebrew names for the deity and Messiah. Followers refer to God as Yahweh, or YHWH, rather than the English God or Lord, and call Jesus by variations like Yeshua, Yeshua, or Yeshua. Some adherents claim the name Jesus itself derives from pagan sources, though mainstream scholars dispute this etymology. Dietary laws become central to daily life. Members follow kosher restrictions, avoiding pork, shellfish, and the mixing of meat and dairy. They argue these commands were never abolished in the New Testament, and that Paul's writings have been misinterpreted to suggest otherwise. The movement exists in a theological gray area that creates tension on multiple fronts. Mainstream Christians often accuse Hebrew Roots adherents of placing themselves back under Old Testament law, which contradicts core Protestant doctrine about salvation through grace alone. Meanwhile, Jewish communities view the movement with suspicion, seeing it as a form of cultural appropriation or stealth conversion tactics, particularly when some groups engage in what critics call messianic evangelism targeting Jewish populations. Internal diversity makes the movement difficult to define precisely. Some followers simply add Jewish practices to their existing Christian beliefs, attending regular church on Sunday and synagogue-style services on Saturday. Others completely reject organized Christianity, forming independent house congregations that operate more like Jewish Shavuot. A subset goes further still, adopting Hebrew as their primary language for prayer and study, wearing tzitzit and kippot, and structuring their entire lives around the Jewish calendar. The Sacred Name movement operates as a more extreme branch, insisting that only specific pronunciations of divine names hold spiritual power. These groups produce Bibles with Yahweh and Yeshua, replacing every instance of God and Jesus, believing that using incorrect names invalidates prayer entirely. Certain teachers within the movement have gained substantial followings. 119 Ministries produces polished video content breaking down Torah observance for modern believers. Teachers like Jim Staley and Mark Biltz draw crowds to conferences where they unpack biblical festivals and prophetic timelines through a Torah-observant lens. Biltz popularized the blood moons prophecy theory in 2008, linking lunar eclipses to biblical festivals and end-times events. The movement attracts conspiracy-minded believers who see mainstream Christianity as compromised by Roman Catholic influence. They trace a through line from Constantine's Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to modern denominational structure, arguing the entire edifice rests on political manipulation rather than scriptural truth. This narrative appeals to those already skeptical of institutional authority. Relationship dynamics become strained when one spouse converts to Hebrew roots observance, while the other remains in mainstream Christianity. The Sabbath alone creates immediate conflict when one partner refuses to work Friday evening through Saturday, while the other sees this as legalism. Christmas becomes a yearly battleground, with Hebrew roots believers refusing to participate in what they view as Saturnalia worship disguised as Christian celebration. The movement faces accusations of replacement theology in reverse. While traditional replacement theology claims the Church has replaced Israel in God's plan, critics argue Hebrew roots adherents appropriate Jewish identity without converting to Judaism, creating what some call Gentile Messianic Judaism. The movement insists they are simply returning to the faith as it existed before the Jewish-Gentile split in early church history. Despite opposition from both Christian and Jewish communities, the movement continues expanding through online platforms and independent congregations, attracting seekers who find conventional Christianity lacking in historical authenticity and biblical rigor. Dievturība is a Latvian neo-pagan faith dedicated to reviving the pre-Christian religious traditions of the Baltic Latvian people. The name itself roughly translates to God-keepers, or guardians of the divine, and the movement first took shape in the 1920s under the guidance of Ernsts Brastinš, a Latvian artist, archaeologist, and nationalist who believed that centuries of forced Christianization had severed his people from their authentic spiritual roots. Brastinš spent years studying Latvian folk songs known as dainas, a massive collection of over 1 million short verses passed down orally through generations. He treated these dainas not as simple folklore, but as fragments of a lost sacred scripture, piecing together from them an entire cosmology, moral code, and ritual calendar that he argued predated Christianity in the region by thousands of years. The central deity in Dievturība is Dievs, a supreme sky god, alongside a pantheon that includes Mara, the Earth Mother associated with material existence and the cycle of life and death, and Laima, the goddess of fate and fortune. Practitioners follow a seasonal cycle of celebrations tied to solstices, equinoxes, and agricultural milestones, with Johnny, the Midsummer Festival, being the most widely recognized even among non-practicing Latvians today. The movement has a complicated political history. It flourished during Latvia's first period of independence as part of a broader cultural nationalism, but was suppressed during the Soviet occupation. Brastinš himself was arrested by Soviet authorities and died in a labor camp in 1942. The faith survived largely through Latvian diaspora communities in exile, particularly in the United States, Canada, and Australia, before experiencing a revival after Latvia regained independence in 1991. That Soviet suppression is actually part of what gives Dievturaba its emotional weight for many Latvians. Practicing it became an act of cultural resistance, a way of asserting a national identity that both Christian missionaries and communist authorities had tried to erase at different points in history. Today, Dievturaba is officially registered as a religion in Latvia, though its practitioners remain a small minority. It sits in an interesting space where ethnic identity, environmentalism, and spiritual practice all overlap, with adherents viewing their faith less as something invented in the 20th century and more as something that was always there, buried under layers of foreign influence, waiting to be uncovered. Latvian mythology is one of the last surviving branches of Baltic paganism, and it's a system that held on far longer than most people realize. While the rest of Europe was converting to Christianity centuries earlier, the Baltic peoples, Latvians and Lithuanians in particular, were still practicing their indigenous faith well into the 1300s and beyond. The Northern Crusades were launched in large part just to force these people to convert, and even after official Christianization, the old beliefs never fully went away. The Latvian pantheon is built around a concept called Dievs, which is both the name of the sky god and the word for the divine itself. Dievs isn't some thundering authority figure sitting on a throne. He's described almost like a wealthy farmer who lives on a hill beyond the sky, wearing a silver robe and a wide-brimmed hat. He walks through fields, tends to crops, and rides horses. It's strangely down to earth for a supreme deity. Below Dievs sits a rich cast of figures. Mara is the earth mother associated with land, cattle, and the cycle of life and death. Lima is the goddess of fate who literally determines your destiny at the moment of birth. And then there's Sol, the sun goddess, who rides across the sky in a chariot, and is one of the most important figures in the entire tradition. Her relationship with the moon god Menes is a whole saga on its own. He's essentially portrayed as unfaithful to her, and the other gods punish him for it, which is why the moon waxes and wanes. The real backbone of Latvian mythology isn't written scripture, it's the Dainas. These are short, poetic folk songs, and Latvia has over 1.2 million of them recorded. That is not a typo. They were passed down orally for generations, and collectively form one of the largest archives of oral tradition anywhere on the planet. The Dainas encode everything from cosmology to ethics to agricultural rituals, all wrapped in dense symbolic language that scholars are still unpacking today. What kept this system alive for so long was its deep integration into daily life. Every tree, every river, every household threshold had spiritual significance. The Latvians practiced a form of animism layered on top of their polytheism, where nature wasn't just sacred in a vague philosophical sense. Specific groves were protected, specific stones were offering sites, and cutting down the wrong tree could bring genuine consequences from the spirit world. Even under centuries of German, Swedish, and Russian rule, Latvian paganism persisted underground, blending with folk Christianity in ways that made it almost impossible to fully stamp out. In the early 20th century, a movement called Dievturaba emerged, which attempted to reconstruct and revive the old faith as a formal religion. It was suppressed during the Soviet occupation, but came back after Latvian independence in 1991, and today it's a legally recognized religion in Latvia. So while most of Europe's pre-Christian traditions survive only in fragments and academic papers, Latvian mythology managed to thread the needle, ancient enough to predate written history, yet alive enough that people are still practicing it right now. Muiscan mythology encompasses the complex spiritual system of the Muisca people, who inhabited the Colombian highlands centuries before Spanish colonization. Their religious practices directly inspired the legendary El Dorado, though the reality proves far more intricate than simple tales of gold-obsessed natives. The Muisca believed their world emerged from the sacred lake Iguaque, where the goddess Bachuay rose from the waters carrying a 3-year-old child. As this child matured, Bachuay took him as her husband, and together they populated the earth with humanity. When their work was complete, both transformed into serpents and returned to the lake's depths, establishing the cyclical nature of Muiscan cosmology. This creation story explains why lakes held such profound significance in their rituals. Lake Guatavita became the site of their most famous ceremony, where newly appointed chiefs would cover themselves in gold dust and dive into the sacred waters, while followers threw golden offerings from the shoreline. The Spanish conquistadors who witnessed these rituals coined the term El Dorado, meaning the Golden One, referring not to a city, but to this golden man himself. Their pantheon included Chiminigagua, the supreme creator who brought light to the world, and Chibchacum, the protector of farmers and goldsmiths who carried the earth on his shoulders. When Chibchacum grew angry with humanity's moral failures, he would shift the world's weight, causing floods and earthquakes across the highlands. The Muisca developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, tracking celestial movements to determine agricultural cycles and ceremonial timing. They believed their ancestors became stars after death, creating a direct connection between earthly actions and cosmic order. Their priests, called jeques, interpreted these stellar patterns to guide political decisions and spiritual practices. What sets Muiscan mythology apart is how thoroughly it integrated with their daily governance. Chiefs weren't just political leaders, but living representatives of divine will, required to maintain cosmic balance through precise ritual observance. Their elaborate gold work wasn't mere decoration, but functional spiritual technology, with each piece designed to channel specific divine energies during ceremonies. Romani folklore refers to the spiritual traditions and supernatural beliefs practiced by the Romani people across Europe and beyond. The Romani originated in northern India around 1,000 years ago before migrating westward, and their folklore blends Hindu influences with European Christianity and indigenous magical practices picked up during centuries of travel. At the center of Romani supernatural belief sits the concept of the mulo, or mulo. These are the spirits of the deceased, particularly those who died violent deaths or weren't properly buried according to tradition. Unlike benign ancestral spirits, mulos actively interfere with the living. They cause illness, steal children, and bring misfortune to families who've wronged them in life. The Romani developed elaborate funeral customs specifically to prevent the dead from returning. Bodies were buried with possessions they might need in the afterlife, ensuring they had no reason to come back for them. The system of Merime, pronounced ma-ri-me, governs spiritual purity and contamination. Certain body parts are considered inherently polluted, particularly the lower half of the body. This creates strict rules about washing clothes, preparing food, and social interactions. A person or object declared marime becomes spiritually contaminated and must be avoided until cleansed. This isn't just symbolic. Violating marime laws can result in social exile from the community, a devastating punishment for a culture built around extended family networks. Romani fortune-telling, or dukering, developed as both a spiritual practice and economic necessity. The stereotype of the Romani fortune-teller has basis in actual tradition. Palmistry, tarot reading, and tea leaf interpretation became genuine skills passed down through family lines, though also commercialized for non-Romani clients. Some Romani women possessed actual psychic gifts according to community accounts, while others simply used psychological observation and cold reading techniques. The tradition of the Queen of the Gypsies appears in various Romani communities, though not universally. These weren't political rulers, but spiritual leaders who mediated disputes, performed blessings, and maintained cultural knowledge. The role combined elements of priest, judge, and elder, with authority coming from demonstrated wisdom rather than hereditary right. Protective charms called Baxtalos guard against curses and evil spirits. Red thread tied around a child's wrist wards off the evil eye. Salt sprinkled across doorways prevents mulos from entering homes. Horse brasses and specific herbs carried in small bags protect travelers on the road. These weren't quaint superstitions, but essential defenses in a worldview where supernatural threats posed constant danger. The Romani concept of drabarni refers to a woman skilled in herbal medicine and healing magic. These practitioners diagnosed illness through a combination of physical examination and spiritual divination, determining whether the cause was natural or supernatural. Their remedies mixed practical herbalism with ritual elements, such as reciting specific phrases while preparing medicines or collecting plants at particular moon phases. Stories of shape-shifting and transformation magic appear throughout Romani folklore. Certain individuals could supposedly transform into animals, usually wolves or birds, to travel unseen or gain information. The distinction between metaphorical transformation and literal bodily change remains deliberately vague in many accounts, reflecting a worldview where the line between physical and spiritual reality blurred considerably. The Apostolic Christian Church is a small, tightly knit denomination that most people have never heard of, despite having roots stretching back to the 1830s in Switzerland. It was founded by Samuel Heinrich Froelich, a Reformed minister who became convinced that the state churches of Europe had drifted so far from the New Testament that they were essentially unrecognizable as Christian institutions. He started baptizing adult converts only, which got him kicked out of the Reformed Church almost immediately. The movement spread across Europe and eventually made its way to the United States in the mid-1800s, where it quietly planted churches across the Midwest. And when I say quietly, I mean it. This is a group that has actively avoided public attention for nearly 2 centuries. Members of the Apostolic Christian Church live by a strict set of standards that would catch most modern Christians off guard. Television and radio were historically forbidden. Women wear head coverings during worship. Men and women sit on opposite sides of the church. Members greet one another with a holy kiss, separated by gender, and there's no musical instruments allowed in services, only unaccompanied singing, which honestly produces this haunting, almost ethereal sound when an entire congregation does it in unison. But the real distinguishing feature is their practice of proving. Before anyone can be baptized, they must go before the elder and the congregation to essentially testify about their conversion experience. The church body then votes on whether or not they believe the conversion is genuine. If the vote doesn't pass, you don't get baptized. The congregation literally decides if your faith is real enough. Church discipline is taken extremely seriously. Members who violate the community's standards can be placed under a form of shunning where other members are forbidden from eating with them or engaging in normal fellowship. This has led to some painful family separations over the years, particularly when younger members choose to leave the faith. The ministry operates on a system that feels almost random to outsiders. Pastors are not seminary trained. Instead, they're selected from the congregation through a process that has historically involved drawing lots, essentially leaving the choice up to what they believe is divine selection. These ministers receive no salary and maintain regular jobs while shepherding their congregations. One of the more fascinating aspects is how geographically concentrated the church remains. The vast majority of its roughly 12,000 members live in small towns scattered across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and a handful of other Midwestern states. Entire towns like Eureka and Roanoke in Illinois have social structures that quietly revolve around the Apostolic Christian Church, even if most outsiders driving through would never notice. The denomination has experienced a few splits over the decades, most notably the formation of the Apostolic Christian Church Nazarene in the early 1900s and the German Apostolic Christian Church, which maintained even stricter Old World traditions. These fractures almost always came down to disagreements about just how separated from mainstream society the church should remain. Anglo-Catholicism is a tradition within the Anglican Church that, for all intents and purposes, looks and feels almost identical to Roman Catholicism, except it technically isn't. We're talking incense, elaborate vestments, veneration of saints, confession booths, and a deep devotion to the sacraments. If you walked into an Anglo-Catholic service without context, you'd genuinely struggle to tell the difference between it and a Roman Catholic Mass. The roots of this movement trace back to the Oxford movement of the 1830s, when a group of Anglican theologians at Oxford University, most notably John Henry Newman, John Keble, and Edward Pusey, began arguing that the Church of England had drifted too far toward Protestantism. They published a series of writings called Tracts for the Times, which made the case that Anglicanism was never meant to be a purely Protestant faith, but rather a middle path that preserved the apostolic traditions of the early church. This earned them the nickname Tractarians. The tension here is genuinely fascinating. When King Henry VIII broke from Rome in the 16th century, the Church of England kept a surprising amount of Catholic structure intact. Anglo-Catholics essentially took that fact and ran with it, arguing that the English Reformation was a political separation from the Pope's authority, not a theological rejection of Catholic doctrine. This created an identity crisis that has never fully resolved. Rome does not recognize Anglo-Catholic priests or sacraments as valid. Many Protestant-leaning Anglicans view Anglo-Catholics with suspicion, sometimes dismissively calling them smells and bells Christians. and Anglo-Catholics themselves occupy this strange liminal space where they practice something that mirrors Catholicism in nearly every visible way, while remaining institutionally separate from it. Newman himself eventually converted to Roman Catholicism entirely, and was later made a cardinal, and then canonized as a saint in 2019. His departure was seen by some as proof that Anglo-Catholicism was just a halfway house on the road to Rome, a criticism the movement has fielded ever since. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI issued a document called Anglicanorum Coetibus, which created a formal pathway for entire Anglo-Catholic congregations to join the Roman Catholic Church while keeping many of their Anglican liturgical traditions. This was widely interpreted as the Vatican essentially opening its doors and saying, "You're already doing what we do, you might as well make it official." Thousands accepted the offer, but many others stayed, insisting that Anglo-Catholicism is its own legitimate expression of the faith, and not merely Catholicism without a pope. Miaphysitism is a theological position held by some of the oldest Christian churches on the planet, and yet most Western Christians have never even heard of it. It centers on a question that literally split the ancient church apart. What exactly is the nature of Jesus Christ? To understand Miaphysitism, you need to know about the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, one of the most consequential meetings in religious history. The council declared that Christ has two distinct natures, one fully divine, one fully human, united in one person, but never mixed or confused. This is the position that Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and most Protestant churches still hold today. The Miaphysites rejected this, not because they thought Christ was only divine or only human, but because they believed his divine and human natures were so perfectly unified that separating them into two, even conceptually, was a mistake. One united nature, formed from two, without confusion, without separation. The word itself comes from the Greek mia, meaning one, and physis, meaning nature. Now this might sound like splitting hairs, and honestly, entire empires thought so too, but the consequences were enormous. The churches that held this position, the Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church among them, were labeled heretics and cut off from mainstream Christianity for over 1,500 years. And they've been called monophysites ever since, lumped in with a completely different heresy that taught Christ had only a divine nature and wasn't truly human at all. The Miaphysites have always considered this a misrepresentation. They explicitly affirm Christ's full humanity and full divinity. They just refuse to count them as two separate things after the union. These are not small, obscure congregations either. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church alone has roughly 40 to 50 million members, making it one of the largest churches in Africa. The Coptic Orthodox Church traces its founding directly to the Apostle Mark. The Armenian Apostolic Church claims to be the first nation to officially adopt Christianity, doing so in 301 AD, over a decade before the Roman Empire. In recent decades, theologians from both sides have started to acknowledge that the divide may have been more about language and politics than actual belief. Joint declarations between the Catholic Church and several Oriental Orthodox churches in the late 20th century essentially admitted that both sides were trying to say the same thing using different words. 15 centuries of schism, potentially rooted in a translation problem. Vedanta is one of the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy, and arguably the one that has had the most lasting impact on how billions of people understand reality itself. The name literally translates to the end of the Vedas, referring to the Upanishads, which are the final portions of Hinduism's oldest sacred texts. So right away, Vedanta positions itself as the ultimate conclusion of ancient wisdom, the part you get to after everything else. At its core, Vedanta is concerned with one enormous question. What is the relationship between the individual soul, called Atman, and the ultimate reality of the universe, called Brahman? And depending on which branch of Vedanta you follow, you get wildly different answers. The most famous branch is Advaita Vedanta, popularized by the 8th century philosopher Adi Shankara. His position was radical and absolute. Atman and Brahman are not just related, they are identical. You, the person listening to this right now, are not separate from the ultimate reality of the cosmos. You are it. The entire world of separate objects, individual people, and distinct experiences is Maya, a kind of cosmic illusion that obscures the truth of total oneness. Shankara argued that ignorance of this unity is the sole cause of suffering, and that liberation comes not from rituals or good deeds, but from direct knowledge of your own true nature. This was not a popular opinion with everyone. A later philosopher named Ramanuja founded Vishishtadvaita, or qualified non-dualism, which pushed back hard. Ramanuja agreed that Brahman is the supreme reality, but argued that individual souls and the material world are real, not illusions. They exist as attributes or parts of Brahman, the way organs exist as parts of a body. For Ramanuja, devotion to a personal god, specifically Vishnu, was the true path to liberation, not abstract philosophical realization. Then there is Dvaita Vedanta, founded by Madhvacharya in the 13th century, which went even further in the opposite direction. Madhva taught strict dualism. The individual soul and God are eternally separate and will never merge into one. Liberation means entering the presence of God, not becoming God. He even taught that some souls are eternally destined for darkness, a concept that has drawn comparisons to Calvinist predestination in Christianity, despite developing completely independently thousands of miles away. The reason Vedanta sits on this iceberg is its sheer philosophical weight and global influence. When Swami Vivekananda addressed the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893, it was primarily Advaita Vedanta he brought to the Western stage. His speech is often credited with sparking the entire Western fascination with Eastern spirituality. From there, Vedantic ideas filtered into the New Age movement, the work of Aldous Huxley, the philosophy of Erwin Schrödinger, who explicitly credited the Upanishads as influencing his thinking on quantum mechanics, and even into modern non-duality teachers on YouTube who may not even realize they are repackaging ideas that Shankara formalized over 1,200 years ago. Vedanta is not a single belief system. It is an ongoing philosophical argument about the nature of existence that has been running for well over 1,000 years, and every major position within it has millions of living adherents today. Heathenry is a modern religious movement built around reviving the pre-Christian spiritual practices of the Germanic and Norse peoples. We're talking about the folks who worshipped Odin, Thor, Freya, and the rest of the Norse pantheon long before Christianity swept through Scandinavia and Northern Europe during the medieval period. Now, this isn't just people who watched too many Marvel movies and decided to start praying to Thor. Heathenry is a serious reconstructionist effort, meaning practitioners actively study historical texts, archaeology, and folklore to piece together how these religions were actually practiced over 1,000 years ago. The primary sources they draw from include the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which are collections of Old Norse mythology and cosmology written down in medieval Iceland. They also pull from the sagas, Anglo-Saxon texts, and even Roman accounts of Germanic tribal customs. In practice, heathens engage in rituals called blots, which are offerings or sacrifices to the gods, ancestors, and land spirits. These days, that typically means pouring mead or leaving food offerings rather than anything involving livestock. They also hold communal feasts called symbols, where participants pass a drinking horn and make oaths, toasts, and boasts. And yes, the boasting is a formal part of the ritual. You're essentially putting your reputation on the line in front of the gods and your community. One of the core philosophical frameworks in heathenry is the concept of weird, which is loosely comparable to fate, but functions more like a web of interconnected actions and consequences. Everything you do weaves into this web and affects not just your own destiny, but your families and communities as well. There's also a heavy emphasis on ancestor veneration. Many heathens maintain altars to deceased family members and believe that the dead continue to influence and protect their living descendants. The relationship between the living and the dead isn't seen as one-directional. It's an ongoing exchange. Now, the elephant in the room. Heathenry has had a long and complicated struggle with white supremacist groups attempting to co-opt Norse symbolism for their own purposes. Runes, Viking imagery, and references to Norse mythology have been adopted by various extremist movements, which has forced the broader heathen community into a constant battle to reclaim their own religious symbols. This has led to a significant internal divide. On one side, you have universalist heathens, who believe the religion is open to anyone, regardless of ethnic background. On the other, there are folkish heathens who argue that Norse spirituality is tied to Northern European ancestry. Many mainstream heathen organizations, like the Troth and Declaration 127, have taken explicit public stances against racism and folkish gatekeeping, but the tension remains an ongoing issue within the community. Despite all of this, heathenry has grown steadily over the past few decades. Iceland actually recognized the Asatruarfélagið, their national heathen organization, as an official religion back in 1973, and it has since become one of the fastest-growing religions in the country. Denmark, Norway, and several other nations have followed suit with their own recognized heathen organizations. So while the mainstream world might still picture heathenry as a niche hobby for Renaissance fair enthusiasts, it's quietly become one of the more organized and historically grounded religious revival movements in the modern world. Tantra is one of the most wildly misunderstood spiritual traditions on the planet. In the West, the word has become almost entirely synonymous with exotic bedroom techniques, which is a bit like reducing all of Christianity down to the wine at communion. The actual tradition is a vast and ancient system of philosophy, ritual, and practice that emerged in India somewhere around the mid-1st millennium CE, and it fundamentally reshaped Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism in ways most people never learn about. At its core, Tantra operates on a radical premise that the physical world is not an obstacle to spiritual liberation, but a vehicle for it. This was a direct challenge to the dominant ascetic traditions of the time, which taught that the body and its desires were traps to be escaped. Tantra flipped that script entirely. The body became a sacred instrument. Sensory experience became a doorway. Even things considered impure or taboo could be deliberately engaged with as a path to enlightenment. This is where the left-hand path, or Vamachara, comes in. Practitioners of this branch would ritually partake in the 5 M's: wine, meat, fish, parched grain, and physical union, all things that were strictly forbidden in Orthodox Hindu practice. The idea was not indulgence for its own sake, but a controlled confrontation with the things that bind ordinary people. By engaging with taboo under ritual conditions, the practitioner could dissolve the mental boundaries between pure and impure, sacred and profane, and experience reality as an undivided whole. The right-hand path, or Dakshinachara, pursued the same goals but through symbolic or internalized versions of these practices rather than literal ones. And for the record, the vast majority of Tantra practitioners, historically and today, follow this path. The sensational stuff gets all the attention, but it was always a minority practice even within Tantra itself. Now, tantric texts called tantras number in the hundreds, and they cover an enormous range of material: mantras, yantras, which are geometric diagrams used for meditation, elaborate visualization practices, energy work involving the chakras and kundalini, deity worship, and yes, some of them do include explicitly intimate ritual instructions. But these were embedded within comprehensive spiritual systems, not isolated as standalone techniques. Buddhist Tantra, known as Vajrayana, became the dominant form of Buddhism in Tibet and Mongolia. It incorporated wrathful deities, complex initiatory hierarchies, and guru-disciple relationships with an intensity that made it one of the most secretive and ritualized forms of Buddhism in existence. Many of its advanced practices were never written down at all, and could only be received directly from a qualified teacher. The Western fascination with Tantra really took off in the 19th century, when colonial scholars and early occultists like Sir John Woodroffe, writing under the pen name Arthur Avalon, began translating tantric texts. But the version that filtered into popular culture was heavily sanitized, romanticized, and stripped of its broader philosophical context. By the time it reached the self-help shelves of the 1990s, Tantra had been reduced to a marketing label for intimacy workshops, a transformation that most traditional practitioners find somewhere between amusing and deeply frustrating. Donghak is a Korean religious movement founded in 1860 by a man named Choi Jae-woo, and its name literally translates to Eastern Learning. That name was chosen as a direct response to what Koreans at the time called Seohak, or Western Learning, which was their term for Catholicism, and the wave of European influence creeping into the Korean peninsula. Choi Jae-woo claimed to have had a mystical experience in 1860 where he received a divine revelation from what he called Hanulim, essentially the Lord of Heaven in traditional Korean cosmology. From this experience, he developed a theology that blended Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Korean shamanism into a single unified system. The core teaching was radical for its time, that every human being carries divinity within them. In a rigidly hierarchical society like Joseon-era Korea, telling peasants that they were essentially equal to the aristocracy was about as welcome as you'd expect. The Korean government branded Donghak as a dangerous heresy, and Choi Jae-woo was arrested and executed in 1864, just 4 years after founding the movement. His death did the opposite of what the authorities intended. The movement grew rapidly among the rural poor and disenfranchised. By 1894, Donghak followers launched what became known as the Donghak Peasant Revolution, one of the largest uprisings in Korean history. Tens of thousands of farmers armed with little more than bamboo spears rose up against corrupt local officials and foreign exploitation. The Korean government panicked and requested military aid from China, which in turn prompted Japan to send its own troops. The rebellion was crushed, but the collision of Chinese and Japanese forces on Korean soil directly triggered the First Sino-Japanese War, fundamentally reshaping the power dynamics of East Asia. The religion itself survived and eventually reorganized under the name Kyeondoism, meaning Religion of the Heavenly Way, which still exists today. Kyeondoism went on to play a major role in the March 1st independence movement of 1919 against Japanese colonial rule. So a peasant religion that started with one man's spiritual experience in a small Korean village ended up being one of the catalysts for wars and independence movements that altered the course of an entire continent. The Church of Christ Scientist was founded in 1879 by Mary Baker Eddy, a woman who claimed to have discovered the science behind the healings performed by Jesus. Her core teaching was radical even by 19th century standards, that sickness, disease, and even death are essentially illusions caused by incorrect thinking, and that true understanding of God can overcome any physical ailment. Eddy laid all of this out in her book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which members treat as almost equal in authority to the Bible itself. Sunday services don't feature a pastor giving sermons. Instead, appointed readers simply read passages from the Bible alongside selections from Eddy's book, and that's the entire service. No personal interpretation, no deviation. The church employs what they call Christian Science practitioners, individuals you can actually hire to pray for your healing. These aren't clergy in any traditional sense. They're listed in the church's official directory, they charge fees, and in some cases, their services have even been covered by health insurance. Now, the obvious concern here is what happens when someone with a treatable medical condition relies entirely on prayer instead of seeing a doctor. And the answer is exactly what you'd expect. There have been numerous documented cases of children dying from conditions like diabetes, meningitis, and bowel obstructions because their parents chose spiritual treatment over medical intervention. Several of these cases went to court, and the legal battles got complicated because many US states actually had religious exemption laws on the books, some of which were lobbied for by the Church of Christ, Scientist itself. Over time, public backlash led multiple states to roll back or narrow these exemptions, but some still exist today. The church also publishes the Christian Science Monitor, which is genuinely one of the most respected newspapers in the world. It's won 7 Pulitzer Prizes. Most people who read it have no idea it's connected to a religious organization that teaches illness is a mental error. Eddy founded the paper in 1908 specifically to counter what she saw as sensationalism in the media, and ironically, it became far more famous than the church itself. At its peak in the 1930s and 40s, the church claimed around 270,000 members in the United States alone. Today, the numbers have dropped so dramatically that the church actually stopped publishing membership figures. Estimates suggest fewer than 50,000 members remain worldwide. Their massive, ornate churches, called reading rooms, can still be found in cities across America, often sitting half-empty as quiet monuments to a movement that once had serious cultural influence. Christian furries are exactly what they sound like, members of the furry fandom who are also devout Christians, and who see no contradiction between the two. And honestly, the tension between these communities is more interesting than you'd expect. The furry fandom, for the uninitiated, is a subculture centered around anthropomorphic animal characters. Animals with human traits. Think cartoon animals, custom animal suits, and elaborate original characters. The community has been around since the early 1980s and has grown into a massive global subculture with its own conventions, art scene, and online infrastructure. Now, mainstream Christianity has historically had a complicated relationship with the furry fandom. Many conservative Christian voices have lumped furries in with everything they consider deviant, painting the entire community as inherently sinful. Some churches have explicitly condemned furry identity as a form of idolatry, or even compared it to the worship of animal-headed gods from ancient pagan religions. Christian furries push back on this pretty hard. Groups like the Christian Furs community have existed online since the early 2000s, creating spaces where members discuss scripture, hold virtual prayer meetings, and commission artwork of their furry characters in biblical settings. Yes, that means there is fan art of anthropomorphic lions quoting Psalms, and it is completely sincere. But they also face friction from within the furry community itself. Because the fandom tends to skew progressive and secular, openly Christian furries sometimes report feeling unwelcome from both directions. Too weird for their church, too churchy for their fandom. Some Christian furries frame their involvement theologically, arguing that creativity and self-expression through anthropomorphic characters is an extension of being made in the image of a creative God. Others point to the long history of animal symbolism in Christianity itself: the Lamb of God, the Lion of Judah, the 4 living creatures in Revelation, which are literally described as anthropomorphic winged beings with animal faces. The community remains small but persistent, occupying one of the stranger intersections of internet subculture and religious devotion, a group that insists you can praise the Lord and have a fursona at the same time. Crow native religion refers to the spiritual traditions of the Epsilon people, more commonly known as the Crow Nation, indigenous to what is now Montana and the surrounding northern plains region. The Crow worldview doesn't separate the sacred from the everyday the way most Western religions do. Everything, from animals to weather patterns to geographic landmarks, carries spiritual weight. The Bighorn Mountains, for example, aren't just a nice backdrop. They're considered a place of immense power where vision quests have been carried out for centuries. And vision quests are central to Crow spirituality. Young men would isolate themselves on mountaintops for days without food or water, enduring the elements until they received a vision from a spiritual being, often an animal or ancestor. These visions weren't abstract feel-good moments. They came with specific instructions, songs, and sometimes physical tokens that would guide the individual for the rest of their life. The being that appeared would become that person's spiritual protector, and ignoring or disrespecting the vision was considered genuinely dangerous. One of the most important figures in Crow spiritual history is Plenty Coups, the last traditional chief of the Crow Nation. As a young boy, his vision quest produced a dream about a great storm destroying every tree in a forest except one, the Lodge of the Chickadee. Tribal elders interpreted this as a prophecy that all the Plains tribes would fall, but the Crow would survive by listening carefully and adapting, like the Chickadee. This single vision shaped decades of Crow political strategy, including their controversial decision to ally with the United States government against other tribes. The Crow also practiced the sun dance, a grueling multi-day ceremony involving fasting, dancing, and in traditional forms, physical sacrifice through piercing of the skin. The U.S. government banned the sun dance across multiple tribes in the late 1800s as part of broader efforts to stamp out indigenous religions entirely. It wasn't until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 that these practices were formally protected by law again. That's roughly 80 years where practicing your own ancestral religion was literally a criminal act on American soil. The Tobacco Society is another tradition unique to the Crow. Unlike what the name might suggest, this isn't about recreational use. Sacred tobacco is planted, cultivated, and harvested through an elaborate series of rituals believed to ensure the survival and prosperity of the entire nation. Membership in the Tobacco Society is earned through adoption by an existing member, and the planting ceremonies involve songs and dances that have been passed down through oral tradition for generations. What ties all of this together is the Crow concept of backspay, or spiritual power. Backspay isn't something you're born with or automatically receive. It has to be earned, gifted, or revealed through experiences like vision quests and ceremonies. Some people accumulate significant bakspe over a lifetime, while others may carry very little. It functions almost like a spiritual currency that determines your ability to influence events, heal the sick, or protect your people. And much like currency, it can be lost through improper behavior or failure to honor your obligations to the spirits who granted it. Madhyamika, also known as the Middle Way School, is one of the most intellectually devastating philosophical traditions to ever emerge from Buddhism. Founded by the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna around the 2nd century CE, this school set out to prove something that sounds almost paradoxical, that nothing in the universe has inherent independent existence. Not objects, not people, not even Buddhist teachings themselves. Nagarjuna's core method was a logical technique called prasanga, which essentially means reduction to absurdity. He would take any claim about the nature of reality, that things exist, that they don't exist, that they both exist and don't exist, or that they neither exist nor don't exist, and systematically dismantle all 4 positions. Every single one. He wasn't arguing for nihilism. He was arguing that our very categories of thinking are fundamentally broken. This concept is called shunyata, or emptiness, and it does not mean that the world is an illusion, or that nothing is real in a casual, hand-wavy sense. It means that every single thing you can point to only exists in dependence on other things. A chair is only a chair because of its parts, the concept of sitting, the language used to describe it, and the mind perceiving it. Remove any of those conditions, and the chair dissolves. Nagarjuna applied this logic to everything: causation, time, motion, the self, and even emptiness itself. Emptiness is also empty. This created a serious problem for rival philosophical schools across India, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. Nagarjuna wasn't just challenging one idea, he was pulling the rug out from under the entire project of metaphysics. Brahmanical philosophers, who relied on concepts like eternal souls and divine substance, found their foundations directly targeted. Even fellow Buddhists who believed in fundamental building blocks of experience called dharmas had to watch those get dismantled too. The tradition eventually split into 2 sub-schools. The Prasangika branch, championed by philosophers like Buddhapalita and later Candrakirti, insisted that Madhyamika should only use negative arguments. Just show the contradictions in your opponent's view and leave it at that. No positive claims, no counter-thesis. The Svatantrika branch, led by Bhavaviveka, argued that you actually needed to put forward your own logical proofs to be taken seriously in Indian philosophical debate. This internal disagreement might sound like academic hair-splitting, but it carried enormous weight. The Prasangika approach essentially says that the moment you assert anything at all, you've already lost. You've attached yourself to a position, and attachment is exactly what Madhyamika is trying to uproot. The Svatantrika side countered that if you never assert anything, you can't even communicate your own philosophy. Centuries later, the Tibetan scholar Tsongkhapa, founder of the Gelug school, the tradition of the Dalai Lamas, declared the Prasangika interpretation to be the highest and most correct view. This decision shaped Tibetan Buddhism for the next 600 years and remains doctrinally dominant today. Madhyamika also played a foundational role in the development of Zen Buddhism in East Asia, where Nagarjuna is considered a patriarch of the lineage. The Zen emphasis on dissolving conceptual thinking and the famous use of paradoxical riddles called koans trace directly back to Madhyamika logic. The entire idea that enlightenment cannot be captured in words or concepts, that's Nagarjuna's fingerprint. What tends to catch people off guard about this tradition is its sheer intellectual rigor. This isn't mystical vagueness. Nagarjuna's primary text, the Mula Madhyamakakarika, reads more like a work of formal logic than a spiritual scripture. He anticipates and dismantles counterarguments with a precision that Western analytic philosophers didn't arrive at independently until centuries later. Some modern scholars have even drawn direct comparisons between Nagarjuna's methods and the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who similarly argued that most philosophical problems are just language confusing itself. Native Miwok religion belongs to the indigenous peoples of Central California, primarily the Sierra Nevada foothills and the coastal regions north of San Francisco Bay. The Miwok weren't a single unified tribe, but rather several distinct groups. The Coast Miwok, Lake Miwok, Bay Miwok, Plains Miwok, and Sierra Miwok, each with their own regional variations on a shared spiritual framework. At the center of Miwok cosmology is Coyote, but not the trickster figure you might be picturing from Saturday morning cartoons. In Miwok tradition, Coyote is a creator deity who shaped the world alongside other first people, powerful beings who existed before humans. Coyote worked with figures like falcon, lizard, and frog to literally construct reality. One well-known Miwok origin story credits Lizard with giving humans 5-fingered hands. Coyote apparently wanted people to have paws like his own, but Lizard insisted on fingers, and thankfully, Lizard won that argument. The Miwok spiritual world was divided into distinct realms. The land of the dead existed in the west, and elaborate mourning ceremonies called cry ceremonies were performed annually to honor the deceased. During these multi-day events, belongings of the dead were burned, professional mourners sang through the night, and the community collectively processed grief on a scale that most modern cultures have largely abandoned. Their religious practices were deeply tied to the Kuksu cult system, a ceremonial tradition shared across several California indigenous groups. Kuksu ceremonies involved dancers wearing elaborate regalia and embodying specific spirit beings. These weren't performances in any theatrical sense. The dancers were understood to literally become the spirits during the rituals. Initiation into the Kuksu society required extensive training and was restricted to selected members of the community, creating a layered system where sacred knowledge was carefully guarded and passed down through generations. The Miwok also maintained a complex relationship with the natural world through what's known as a moiety system. Every person, animal, and element in the world belonged to one of two halves, the water side or the land side. You inherited your moiety from your father, and you could only marry someone from the opposite side. This wasn't just social organization, it was a cosmological principle. The Miwok saw the entire universe as built on this fundamental division and balance between two interconnected halves. European colonization, and especially the California mission system, devastated Miwok populations and suppressed their religious practices for generations. The ghost dance movement of the late 1800s briefly revitalized some spiritual practices among surviving Miwok communities, but much traditional knowledge was lost during the colonial period. Today, descendants of the Miwok continue working to preserve and revive their ancestral traditions, though the full depth of pre-contact Miwok spirituality may never be fully recovered. Native Nivk religion centers on the spiritual practices of the Nivk people, an indigenous group living along the Amur River estuary and northern Sakhalin Island in far eastern Russia. Their traditional belief system offers one of the most well-documented examples of bear worship anywhere in the world. The Nivk universe operates on the principle that every natural element possesses its own spirit. Rivers, mountains, trees, and animals each contain conscious beings that demand proper respect and ritual treatment. Breaking these protocols brings misfortune not just to individuals, but to entire clans. The bear holds special status in Nivk cosmology. They believe bears are mountain spirits who temporarily take physical form to visit the human world. The Nivk practice of sending the bear back involves a multi-day ceremony where a captured bear cub is raised for several years, treated as an honored guest, then ceremonially ended in an elaborate festival. The ritual sends the bear's spirit back to the mountain realm carrying gifts and messages of respect. When performed correctly, the bear spirit returns to its mountain home and speaks favorably of the Nivk people, ensuring successful hunts and protection. Each Nivk clan traces descent from a specific animal ancestor. These clan totems dictate marriage restrictions and hunting taboos. A person from the bear clan cannot marry another bear clan member and must observe specific rituals when encountering bears. The same applies to tiger clans, eagle clans, and others. Nivik shamans serve as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. They enter trance states to diagnose illness, negotiate with angry spirits, and retrieve lost souls. Their distinctive costumes incorporate metal ornaments that jingle during ceremonies, producing sounds believed to attract helpful spirits while repelling malevolent ones. The religion divides the cosmos into three realms. The upper world belongs to sky spirits and celestial beings. The middle world contains humans, animals, and nature spirits. The lower world houses the souls of the deceased and darker entities. Shamans possess the unique ability to journey between these realms during their trance work. Fire receives particular reverence as a living entity that must never be insulted. Spitting into flames, throwing garbage into a hearth, or stepping over a fire constitutes serious spiritual offense. The Nivk maintain elaborate protocols for starting fires, feeding them, and putting them out. Seneca Mythology comes from one of the original 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often referred to by outsiders as the Iroquois. The Seneca people called themselves the Onondaga, meaning people of the Great Hill, and their spiritual traditions are some of the oldest continuously practiced belief systems in North America. Their creation story begins not on Earth, but in a sky world that existed long before the ground beneath us. A woman known as Sky Woman fell through a hole in that upper realm, and as she plummeted toward an endless ocean below, birds and water animals worked together to catch her and build land on the back of a giant turtle. That turtle's shell became the foundation of the entire world, which is why many indigenous traditions refer to North America as Turtle Island. This isn't just a poetic name. It's a literal cosmological claim about the origin of the continent. The Seneca spiritual world is populated by beings that don't fit neatly into Western categories of good and evil. The most well-known are the flying heads, disembodied giant heads with wild hair and enormous fangs that soar through the night sky, feeding on anything they can find. Then there are the stone coats, or Janosqua, towering humanoid figures covered in rock-hard skin that makes them nearly impossible to harm. Some researchers have drawn comparisons between stonecoat descriptions and Bigfoot sightings in the northeastern United States, though the Seneca themselves treat these as entirely distinct beings with their own spiritual significance. One of the more fascinating aspects of Seneca belief is the role of dreams. Dreams were not treated as random mental noise. They were considered direct messages from the soul, and ignoring them could cause genuine illness or misfortune. The Seneca practiced elaborate dream-sharing rituals where the community would come together to help an individual fulfill the desires revealed in their dreams, even if those desires seemed bizarre or impractical. Some European missionaries who witnessed these ceremonies in the 1600s compared them, with obvious discomfort, to something closer to organized therapy than anything they recognized as religion. The False Face Society is one of the most secretive elements of Seneca's spiritual practice. Members carve sacred masks from living trees, and these masks are believed to hold real spiritual power. The ceremonies involving them are so protected that the Seneca have actively pushed back against museums displaying the masks, arguing that removing them from their ritual context isn't just disrespectful, it's spiritually dangerous. Several institutions have returned false face masks after prolonged disputes, and photographing or reproducing them remains deeply taboo within the community. The Seneca also maintained a belief in a figure called the Great Peacemaker, who arrived during a period of brutal intertribal conflict and established the Great Law of Peace, a sophisticated governance system that unified warring nations under a democratic confederacy. Some historians have argued that this system directly influenced the formation of the United States Constitution, a claim that gained enough traction for the U.S. Congress to pass a resolution in 1988 officially acknowledging the contribution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to American democratic principles. Others dispute the extent of that influence, but the structural parallels between the two systems are difficult to ignore entirely. The Church of the Subgenius is a parody religion founded in 1979 by Ivan Stang and Philo Drummond, built around the worship of a fictional salesman named J.R. Bob Dobbs, whose face you've almost certainly seen before. That clip art style portrait of a grinning man with a pipe has been plastered on stickers, flyers, and bathroom walls for decades. The central doctrine revolves around the concept of slack, which is essentially the pursuit of personal freedom, leisure, and the rejection of what they call the conspiracy, their catch-all term for the soul-crushing forces of corporate culture, conformity, and mediocrity that drain the joy out of everyday life. Members, who call themselves subgenii, pay $30 for official ordination and are promised eternal salvation, or triple their money back. The church teaches that the world will end on July 5, 1998, known as X Day, when alien pleasure ships called the Xists were supposed to descend from Planet X and rapture all card-carrying subgenii off the Earth. When that date came and went with no alien ships in sight, the church simply declared a miscalculation and has held an X-Day celebration every July 5th since. They're now on over 25 consecutive missed apocalypses and counting. But beneath the absurdist comedy, the Church of the Subgenius functions as a surprisingly sharp cultural critique. It uses the language and structure of televangelism, self-help movements, and UFO cults to mock all of them simultaneously. Their pamphlets and books, particularly the Book of the Subgenius, read like a fever dream collision between a late-night infomercial and a doomsday prophecy. The movement attracted a serious following in underground and counterculture circles throughout the 1980s and 90s, particularly among punk musicians, early internet communities, and zine culture. It influenced groups like the Discordians and shares DNA with later internet-era satire religions. Some scholars actually study it as a legitimate form of culture jamming, using the tools of mainstream culture against itself to expose how absurd those systems already are. The church still operates today, and Bob, always in quotes, always with the pipe, remains one of the most recognizable symbols of organized satirical religion in the Western world. The Fourth Way is a spiritual and philosophical system developed by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff in the early 20th century, later expanded and popularized by his student P.D. Uspensky. The core premise is almost insulting in how direct it is. Gurdjieff taught that human beings, as they normally exist, are essentially asleep, not metaphorically dozing off, but genuinely unconscious, moving through life as biological machines, reacting automatically to stimuli without ever truly waking up. The name Fourth Way comes from Gurdjieff's classification of traditional spiritual paths. The first way is that of the fakir, who masters the physical body through extreme discipline. The second is the way of the monk, who works through faith and emotional devotion. The third is the way of the yogi, who develops the mind and intellect. Each of these requires withdrawal from ordinary life. The fourth way, by contrast, is meant to be practiced while living in the everyday world, working on body, emotion, and mind simultaneously. Gurdjieff's teaching methods were notoriously unorthodox. He would assign students grueling physical labor, abruptly change plans, create deliberate interpersonal friction, and generally make life as uncomfortable as possible. The idea was that real self-awareness only emerges under pressure. Comfort keeps you asleep. He ran an institute outside Paris called the Prieuré at the Château du Prieuré in Fontainebleau, where students lived and worked under these intense conditions throughout the 1920s. One of the more fascinating concepts in the system is what Gurdjieff called self-remembering, the practice of simultaneously being aware of yourself and your surroundings at the same time. Try it right now, and you'll notice it's almost impossible to sustain for more than a few seconds before your attention collapses back into autopilot. That difficulty, according to Gurdjieff, is proof of the problem. Another key idea is the Enneagram, a 9-pointed geometric symbol that Gurdjieff introduced as a model for understanding processes and personality types. If that word sounds familiar, it's because the modern Enneagram personality system that flooded social media and corporate team-building workshops traces directly back to this esoteric teaching, though most people using it today have no idea where it actually came from. After Gurdjieff's death in 1949, the Fourth Way splintered into various lineages and groups, some maintaining the rigor of the original teaching, and others drifting into territory that critics describe as cult-like. Robert Earl Burton's Fellowship of Friends, founded in 1970 in California, claimed to be a Fourth Way school, but became one of the more controversial offshoots, facing allegations of manipulation and abuse of members over several decades. The Fourth Way sits in a genuinely strange position in the landscape of spiritual traditions. It's too structured and demanding to be casual self-help, too unconventional to fit neatly into any established religion, and too focused on practical results to be purely philosophical. Gurdjieff himself remains one of the most polarizing figures in 20th century esoteric history, described with equal conviction as either a profound awakened teacher or an extraordinarily skilled con man. The Methodist Episcopal Church is one of the most influential Protestant denominations in American history, and its story is really a story about what happens when a church tries to hold a nation together and fails. It all starts with John Wesley, an Anglican minister in the 18th century England who never actually intended to start a new denomination. Wesley's thing was methodical devotion to scripture and disciplined spiritual practice, which is where the name Methodist comes from. His followers were originally just a movement within the Church of England, but when the American Revolution happened, Anglican priests in the colonies fled back to Britain, leaving American Methodists with no one to administer sacraments like communion or baptism. So, in 1784, Wesley took matters into his own hands and ordained ministers specifically for America, which was a massive breach of Anglican protocol. This led to the formal creation of the Methodist Episcopal Church at the famous Christmas conference in Baltimore. The Episcopal part of the name refers to their governance structure, meaning they kept bishops, but operated independently from England. Now the church grew at an absolutely absurd rate. Circuit riders, essentially traveling preachers on horseback, spread Methodism across the American frontier like wildfire. By the mid-1800s, the Methodist Episcopal Church was the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. These circuit riders would cover enormous territories, preaching in barns, fields, and homes, often risking their lives to reach isolated communities. But the thing that tore it apart was the same thing tearing the country apart: slavery. In 1844, the church split into the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South after a bishop from Georgia was found to have inherited enslaved people through marriage. The northern branch wanted him to give them up. The southern branch said church leadership had no authority to make that demand. The resulting schism was one of the largest institutional fractures in pre-Civil War America, and many historians argue that the breaking of national churches like this one actually made the Civil War more likely by removing one of the last remaining institutions that bound North and South together. The two branches would not reunite until 1939, and even then, the reunion came with a deeply uncomfortable compromise. They created a segregated jurisdictional structure called the Central Jurisdiction, which lumped all black congregations into a separate administrative body regardless of geography. This system persisted until 1968, when the Methodist Episcopal Church merged with several other Methodist bodies to form the United Methodist Church. And the cycle arguably repeated itself in the 2000s, when the United Methodist Church experienced another massive split, this time over the inclusion of LGBTQ members and clergy. Thousands of congregations left to form the Global Methodist Church. So from slavery to civil rights to modern social debates, this denomination has essentially served as a mirror for whatever is dividing American society at the time. The Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, often shortened to LCMS, is one of the largest Lutheran denominations in the United States, and to outsiders, it can come as a surprise just how strict it actually is. Because when most people hear Lutheran, they picture a fairly relaxed, mainline Protestant church. Maybe some hymns, a potluck dinner, and not much else. The Missouri Synod is a very different animal. Founded in 1847 by German immigrants in the state of Missouri, the LCMS holds to what it calls a confessional Lutheran theology, meaning it takes the original writings of Martin Luther and the Lutheran confessions not as historical documents you can take or leave, but as the correct and binding interpretation of Scripture. Every word of the Bible is considered inerrant, literally true, cover to cover. That includes a literal six-day creation, a young earth, and a real physical Adam and Eve. This puts the Missouri Synod at odds not just with secular science, but with most other Lutheran bodies. The largest Lutheran group in America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ordains women, welcomes openly gay clergy, and takes a much more flexible approach to interpreting the Bible. The Missouri Synod does none of that. Women cannot be ordained as pastors. The denomination formally opposes same-sex relationships. And members are generally expected to only take communion at LCMS churches, a practice called closed communion that can genuinely catch visitors off guard when they're turned away at the altar rail. One of the more fascinating chapters in LCMS history is the Semineks affair of 1974. The president of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis was removed from his position after accusations that he and a number of faculty members were teaching a more modern, historical critical approach to the Bible. In response, the majority of the seminary's faculty and students literally walked out and formed their own institution, Semineks, short for Seminary in Exile. The resulting fallout split congregations, ended careers, and pushed tens of thousands of more moderate members out of the denomination entirely. The LCMS also runs one of the largest private school systems in the United States, with over 1,000 schools and universities operating under its umbrella. This gives the denomination an outsized influence on education compared to its membership numbers, which sit at around 1.8 million. It ends up on an iceberg like this, not because it's a cult or a fringe group. It's a well-established, historically significant denomination, but because the gap between how most people perceive Lutheranism and how the Missouri Synod actually operates is genuinely striking. It functions as one of the most theologically rigid major Protestant bodies in America, and a lot of people sitting in the pews of other churches have no idea it even exists. The Nation of Yahweh was a black Hebrew Israelite offshoot founded in 1979 by Hulon Mitchell Jr., who renamed himself Yahweh ben Yahweh, literally meaning God, Son of God. Based out of Miami, Florida, the group taught that black people were the true biblical Israelites and that Mitchell was the literal Messiah sent to lead them to salvation. On the surface, the Nation of Yahweh actually did some genuinely impressive community work. They bought up rundown properties in Liberty City, one of Miami's poorest neighborhoods, and renovated them. They opened grocery stores, created jobs, and were publicly praised by Miami's mayor, and even given the keys to the city. Politicians lined up for photo ops. It looked like a legitimate success story. Behind closed doors, things were very different. Mitchell demanded absolute loyalty from his followers, requiring members to cut ties with their families and hand over their finances. He lived lavishly while many of his followers lived in communal housing under strict rules. Dissent was not tolerated in any capacity. The darkest chapter involved a secret inner circle known as the Brotherhood, sometimes called the Death Angels. To gain entry, members allegedly had to bring Mitchell a gruesome proof of loyalty, the severed body parts of a so-called White Devil. Between 1981 and 1986, at least 14 people were murdered in connection to the group, including both white victims targeted at random and former members who had tried to leave. In 1990, Mitchell and several of his followers were indicted under federal racketeering charges. The trial revealed the extent of the violence carried out in his name. Mitchell was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He was released in 2001 under strict conditions, including no contact with former followers. He died in 2007, but remarkably, the Nation of Yahweh still exists today in a diminished form. Some remaining members continue to regard him as the returned Messiah, maintaining that the charges were a government-led persecution of a powerful black religious leader. It's one of those cases where a group did real, tangible good for a community while simultaneously operating one of the most violent cult structures in American history. The Old Catholic Church refers to a collection of independent Catholic denominations that broke away from Rome in the 1870s, though most people have never heard of them despite their presence in dozens of countries worldwide. The split happened over a single theological point that the Vatican considered non-negotiable. In 1870, the First Vatican Council declared the doctrine of papal infallibility, stating that when the Pope speaks on matters of faith and morals from his official position, he cannot be wrong. A group of clergy and theologians across Europe rejected this wholesale. They argued the doctrine had no basis in early Christianity and represented a dangerous consolidation of power. Rather than accept the new teaching, they simply left. The breakaway was led by figures like German theologian Johann Joseph Ignaz von Döllinger and Bishop Eduard Herzog of Switzerland. These weren't fringe radicals, but established scholars and church leaders who saw themselves as preserving authentic Catholicism against Roman innovation. They formed what became known as the Old Catholic Church, with the Old signifying their claim to represent the original pre-Vatican I tradition. The fascinating part comes from what they kept versus what they changed. Old Catholics maintained apostolic succession, meaning their bishops trace their ordination lineage back to the original apostles, just like Rome does. They celebrate the same 7 sacraments, use similar liturgy, and their churches look virtually identical to Roman Catholic ones. Someone walking into an Old Catholic Mass might not notice any difference at first glance. But the distinctions matter. Old Catholic priests can marry. The Church began ordaining women as priests in some national branches during the 1990s. They're in full communion with Anglicans in many regions. Confession is optional rather than mandatory. They reject the Immaculate Conception of Mary and other late medieval doctrines. The Union of Utrecht, established in 1889, serves as their central coordinating body, though each national church operates independently. The Polish National Catholic Church in the United States, which formed in 1897 over ethnic tensions with Irish-dominated American Catholicism, later joined the Old Catholic movement. Their numbers remain relatively small, with perhaps 500,000 members globally compared to over 1 billion Roman Catholics. This obscurity works both ways. Many Catholics don't know Old Catholics exist, and many Old Catholics get mistaken for Roman Catholics by outsiders. The Waldensians are one of the oldest protest movements in Christian history, and they were doing it about 300 years before Martin Luther ever thought about nailing anything to a church door. Founded around 1173 by a wealthy merchant from Lyon named Peter Waldo, the movement started when Waldo decided to actually read the Bible for himself. At the time, scripture was only available in Latin, which most common people couldn't understand. So Waldo commissioned translations into the local vernacular and started preaching in the streets, giving away his entire fortune in the process. His message was simple. The Catholic Church had strayed far from the poverty and humility that Jesus actually taught. The Waldensians rejected the authority of the Pope, denied the existence of purgatory, refused to venerate saints, and insisted that any believer, not just ordained priests, could preach the gospel. They also opposed taking oaths and condemned capital punishment, positions that were genuinely radical for medieval Europe. Naturally, the Church did not take this well. Pope Lucius III declared them heretical in 1184, and what followed were centuries of systematic persecution. We're talking inquisitions, forced conversions, and outright massacres. One of the most notorious events was the Piedmont Easter of 1655, where Catholic troops were sent into Waldensian valleys in northern Italy and carried out mass slaughter of men, women, and children. The brutality was so extreme that it prompted the English poet John Milton to write a famous sonnet about it, and Oliver Cromwell himself threatened military intervention on their behalf. The Waldensians survived by retreating deep into the Alpine valleys of what is now the border region between Italy and France. They essentially became an underground church, practicing their faith in secret for generations, while the rest of Europe tried to wipe them out. When the Protestant Reformation finally arrived in the 1500s, the Waldensians found natural allies in figures like John Calvin and aligned themselves with the Reformed tradition. But even then, full legal recognition didn't come until 1848, when King Charles Albert of Sardinia granted them civil rights, nearly 700 years after their founding. The Waldensians still exist today. They operate as a small but active Protestant denomination primarily in Italy, and they're often cited as living proof that dissent against institutional Christianity didn't begin with Luther. They were just early enough that history nearly erased them entirely. Jeung San Do is a Korean new religious movement founded in the 1970s by An Gyeong-jeon, built around the teachings of a figure named Gang Jung-san, who lived from 1871 to 1909. Gang Jung-san is considered by followers to be the supreme ruler of the universe who incarnated in human form during the late Joseon dynasty, a period of immense suffering and upheaval in Korea. The core belief system revolves around something called Cheonji Gongsa, which translates roughly to the reordering of heaven and earth. According to Jeung San Do, Gang Jung-san performed a series of cosmic rituals over 9 years that fundamentally restructured the spiritual laws governing reality itself, not just Earth, but the entire universe. He allegedly resolved billions of years' worth of accumulated grievances among spirits, gods, and humans that had thrown the natural order into chaos. Now, Jeung San Do distinguishes itself from other Korean new religions that also revere Gang Jung-san, and there are several. Groups like Daesun Jinriho and various Jungsan lineage movements all trace back to the same historical figure, but diverge sharply on doctrine, succession, and interpretation. Jeung San Do positions itself as the most authentic continuation of his original teachings, claiming other groups distorted or lost key elements of the message. Their cosmology is genuinely elaborate. They teach that human history operates in cosmic seasons, much like the natural year. Humanity has been living through a cosmic summer of growth and conflict, and we are now entering a cosmic autumn, which will bring a period of unification and spiritual harvest. This transition is not gentle. It involves a prophesied global crisis they call Gaegbyuk, a kind of apocalyptic transformation that will involve widespread disease, natural disasters, and the collapse of existing civilizations before a new paradise emerges. The movement operates a television network called STB, which broadcasts their teachings and cultural programming across South Korea. They also publish extensively and hold large-scale conferences and meditation events. Their membership numbers are difficult to verify independently, but they claim millions of followers, a figure that outside researchers tend to view with some skepticism. One of the more fascinating aspects of their theology is the emphasis on Tayo mantra, chanting as a survival mechanism for the coming apocalypse. Followers are taught that reciting this specific mantra will literally protect them during the prophesied catastrophes. It functions almost like a spiritual insurance policy, except the premiums are paid in syllables. Asianism is one of those ideological movements that started with a genuinely noble idea and then got twisted into something far more dangerous. At its core, it's the belief that the nations and peoples of Asia share a deep civilizational bond, one that should unite them against Western colonial domination. And in the mid to late 1800s, when European powers were carving up the continent like a buffet, that sentiment made a lot of sense. The roots go back to thinkers like Okakura Tenshin, a Japanese art historian who famously wrote Asia is One in 1903. His argument was cultural. He saw a shared spiritual and artistic thread running from the Arabian deserts through India and into China and Japan, connecting all of Asia through traditions like Buddhism and Confucian thought. It was romantic, idealistic, and genuinely compelling as a counter-narrative to Western supremacy. But Japan ran with it in a very different direction. As Japan modernized and militarized in the early 20th century, Asianism became the philosophical backbone of imperial expansion. The idea was rebranded into what was called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a concept promoted during World War II that framed Japanese conquest as liberation. The argument was that Japan, as the most advanced Asian nation, had a duty to free its neighbors from Western colonialism and lead them into a new era of shared prosperity. In practice, this meant brutal occupation, forced labor, and the systematic exploitation of nearly every country Japan invaded. Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and many others suffered enormously under a regime that used the language of brotherhood to justify domination. The co-prosperity sphere was cooperation in name only. What makes Asianism worth examining on this iceberg is that it never fully went away. Pan-Asian solidarity movements have resurfaced repeatedly in different forms throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Some are genuinely focused on cultural exchange and mutual economic benefit. Others lean into ethno-nationalist territory, arguing for Asian racial superiority or promoting exclusionary identity politics. There are modern online communities that blend Asianist ideas with everything from anti-Western conspiracy theories to esoteric spiritual traditions, creating a strange fusion of geopolitics and mysticism. Some frame the rise of China and the broader shift of global power toward Asia as the fulfillment of a kind of civilizational prophecy, one that Okakura and others supposedly foresaw over a century ago. The uncomfortable tension at the heart of Asianism has always been the same. Unity against outside domination sounds empowering until you ask the obvious follow-up. Who gets to lead, and what happens to everyone who disagrees with that leadership? Japan answered that question with an empire. The ideology's modern inheritors are still wrestling with it. Weixin, also known as Weixin Shengjiao, is a syncretic religious movement founded in Taiwan in 1984 by a man named Hun Yuan, who also goes by the title Grand Master. The religion blends together elements of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, which on its own isn't particularly unusual for East Asian new religious movements. Plenty of spiritual groups in the region pull from multiple traditions. But Weixin takes things a step further by claiming to unify all of these into one singular cosmic truth, with Hun Yuan positioned as the living master who can transmit divine energy directly to followers. The practice centers heavily around qi cultivation and feng shui, but on a scale most people wouldn't expect. We're not talking about rearranging your living room furniture. Weixin has pushed for massive feng shui-based architectural projects and public works, arguing that properly aligning spiritual energy across physical spaces can bring peace and prosperity to entire nations. Hun Yuan has also made some bold claims about his own spiritual authority, positioning himself as a figure capable of communicating with deities and ancestors across multiple religious traditions simultaneously. Followers are encouraged to participate in elaborate ceremonies, donate to the organization's various projects, and spread the teachings internationally. The movement has drawn criticism in Taiwan for its aggressive expansion, its fundraising tactics, and the level of devotion expected from members. Critics have accused the group of operating more like a personality-driven organization built around Hun Yuan's authority than a genuine theological movement. Supporters, naturally, push back on this and frame the criticism as misunderstanding of their spiritual mission. Wakesonism has made efforts to gain legitimacy on the global stage, including attempts to engage with the United Nations and international interfaith organizations. They've hosted large-scale prayer events marketed as efforts toward world peace, which has helped them build a public-facing image that looks quite different from the more insular practices reported by former members. It sits in that gray area where the line between ambitious religious movement and something more controlling becomes very difficult to pin down from the outside. The true Russian Orthodox Church is one of several groups that split from the Moscow Patriarchate, claiming that the official Russian Orthodox Church sold its soul, sometimes almost literally, by cooperating with the Soviet government. The roots of this movement go back to the 1920s and 30s, when the Bolsheviks didn't just discourage religion, they actively infiltrated and weaponized it. The Soviet secret police installed compliant clergy, turned priests into informants, and essentially turned the official church into an arm of state surveillance. A number of bishops and priests refused to go along with this, forming what became known as the Catacomb Church, underground communities of believers who conducted services in secret, often in basements, private homes, and yes, actual catacombs. These weren't just theological disagreements. Getting caught practicing outside the state-approved church could mean a trip to the Gulag or worse. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, you'd think everything would just sort itself out. It did not. Several groups emerged claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the pre-Soviet Russian Orthodox tradition, and the true Russian Orthodox Church is among the most prominent. Their core argument is that the Moscow Patriarchate remains spiritually contaminated by decades of KGB collaboration, and that no amount of post-Soviet rebranding can undo that compromise. The thing is, they have receipts. Declassified KGB documents revealed that numerous high-ranking clergy in the official church, including patriarchs, had been active agents or cooperators with Soviet intelligence. We're talking code names, handler meetings, the whole operation. The true Russian Orthodox Church exists today as a collection of loosely affiliated groups rather than one unified body, which has led to its own set of internal disputes about who among them is the most authentically Orthodox. They reject ecumenism, refuse communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, and generally regard the mainstream church's post-Soviet reconciliation efforts as cosmetic at best. Their numbers are relatively small, but their existence poses an uncomfortable question that the official Russian Orthodox Church has never fully answered. How do you reclaim spiritual authority after spending 70 years as a government asset? Noahidism is a monotheistic belief system built around 7 laws that, according to the Torah, God gave to Noah after the Great Flood. These aren't the 10 Commandments. These are an older, more universal set of rules that Jewish tradition says apply to every single human being on earth, regardless of whether they're Jewish or not. The 7 Noahide laws prohibit idolatry, blasphemy, murder, theft, sexual immorality, and eating flesh torn from a living animal, while also requiring the establishment of courts of justice. That's it. Follow those 7 rules, and according to rabbinic teaching, you're considered a righteous Gentile with a guaranteed place in the world to come. No conversion to Judaism necessary. Noahidism as an actual organized movement is relatively modern. Small communities of non-Jews around the world have taken these laws seriously and built their entire spiritual lives around them. They study Torah, follow rabbinic guidance, and observe certain Jewish customs, but they aren't Jewish and don't try to be. They exist in this strange theological middle ground, bound by Jewish law but permanently outside the Jewish people. This is where things get complicated. Critics, particularly within certain Christian and secular circles, see Noahidism as a framework for a 2-tiered religious system. Jews follow 613 commandments. Everyone else follows 7. Some conspiracy-minded voices point to a 1991 joint resolution signed by President George H.W. Bush, known as Education Day, which explicitly referenced the 7 Noahide laws as the bedrock of civilized society. For many, a sitting US president publicly endorsing a set of laws rooted in Talmudic Judaism felt deeply strange and raised questions about the relationship between religious authority and government power. Supporters argue it's the most inclusive concept in Jewish theology, essentially saying non-Jews don't need to become Jewish to be considered good and righteous. Detractors argue the laws carry severe traditional punishments, including capital punishment for violations like idolatry, which under strict interpretation could technically apply to Christian worship of Jesus or Hindu devotion to multiple deities. Whether Noahidism is a beautiful expression of universal ethics or a controversial theological hierarchy depends entirely on who you ask, but its quiet growth around the world, from the Philippines to Nigeria to rural America, suggests it's tapping into something a lot of people are searching for. The Galilean Rite refers to what some scholars and traditionalist Christians believe was the original form of worship practiced by Jesus' earliest followers in the Galilee region, before the Church of Rome standardized everything into the liturgy we recognize today. The core claim is straightforward. The apostles and first-generation Christians didn't worship anything like modern Catholics or Orthodox believers do. Their gatherings were closer to Jewish synagogue services, blended with communal meals, Aramaic prayers, and a loosely structured format that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone sitting in a cathedral today. What draws people to this concept is the implication buried underneath it. If the earliest Christians worshipped in a fundamentally different way, then centuries of Roman liturgical authority rest on a foundation that was, at best, a dramatic reinterpretation of the original intent. Some researchers point to the Didache, a first-century Christian text rediscovered in 1873, as one of the few surviving windows into these early practices. The prayers and instructions found in it don't align neatly with any modern denomination's worship format. Baptisms were preferred in cold, running water. Fasting happened on Wednesdays and Fridays specifically to differentiate from Jewish fasting days. The Eucharistic prayers reference the vine of David rather than the body and blood language that became standard later. The Galilean Rite as a distinct liturgical tradition eventually got absorbed and overwritten, mostly by the Roman Rite in the West and various Eastern rites in the other direction. By the time the medieval church had consolidated power, any trace of how a fisherman in Capernaum would have actually prayed with his community was essentially gone. For some fringe Christian movements, reconstructing or reviving this lost rite is a way to strip away what they see as layers of imperial Roman influence that turned a simple Galilean movement into a global institution. Others argue the rite never existed as a single coherent system at all, and that early Christian worship was so fragmented and localized that calling it a rite gives it far more structure than it ever actually had. Either way, the gap between what the earliest followers of Jesus were actually doing and what any modern church claims to preserve is wider than most believers are comfortable thinking about. Arnoldists were the followers of Arnold of Brescia, a 12th century Italian monk who decided that the Catholic Church had no business owning property, wielding political power, or living in luxury while preaching poverty. And he said this loudly, publicly, and repeatedly, which in medieval Europe was essentially signing your own death warrant. Arnold studied under Peter Abelard, one of the most controversial theologians of the era, and quickly developed a reputation for being a thorn in the side of church leadership. His core argument was simple. If clergy were supposed to follow Christ's example, they should give up their lands, their wealth, and their political authority. Any priest who owned property or held secular power was, in Arnold's view, living in a state of sin, and their sacraments were therefore invalid. This was not a fringe complaint. Arnold managed to build a genuine political movement in Rome during the 1140s, helping to establish a short-lived commune that stripped the Pope of his temporal authority over the city. For a brief window, Rome was essentially governed by a populist republic inspired by the old Roman Senate, with Arnold as its spiritual backbone. The Church and the Holy Roman Empire eventually decided they'd had enough. Pope Adrian IV placed all of Rome under interdict, meaning no religious services for anyone in the entire city, until the Romans handed Arnold over. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had him seized, and Arnold was hanged, his body burned, and his ashes scattered into the Tiber River. The scattering was deliberate. Church authorities wanted to make sure there would be no remains left behind for his followers to venerate as relics. But the movement didn't die with him. His followers, the Arnoldists, continued to reject clerical wealth and church authority for decades afterward. They blended into other reform movements that were popping up across Europe, many of which carried the same basic message, that the institutional church had become exactly the kind of corrupt earthly kingdom it was supposed to stand against. Arnold's ideas kept resurfacing in various forms, feeding into later groups like the Waldensians, and arguably laying some of the earliest groundwork for the Protestant Reformation nearly 4 centuries later. Assemblies of Yahweh is a sacred name movement organization founded in 1966 by Jacob O. Meyer in Bethel, Pennsylvania. Their core belief is one that sets them apart from mainstream Christianity in a pretty fundamental way. They insist that the true name of the Creator is Yahweh, and that His Son's name is Yeshua, not Jesus. And according to them, using the correct names isn't just a preference, it's a requirement for salvation. The group teaches that centuries of translation and theological revision essentially stripped the original Hebrew names out of Scripture and replaced them with titles and substitutes. They point to passages in the book of Acts and the Hebrew prophets to argue that calling upon the sacred name is the only path to a genuine relationship with the divine. Every other label, including God, Lord, and Jesus, is treated as a pagan corruption. Meyer himself became a prominent figure in the sacred name movement through decades of radio and television broadcasting, most notably the program The Sacred Name Broadcast, which at its peak aired across hundreds of stations. He positioned the Assemblies of Yahweh as the one true congregation carrying out the faith as it was originally practiced in the 1st century. The organization follows a strict interpretation of Old Testament law, including observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, the biblical feast days like Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles, and dietary laws from Leviticus. They reject Christmas, Easter, and other mainstream Christian holidays as having roots in ancient paganism, a claim that, to be fair, does have some historical backing depending on who you ask. Where things get more controversial is in the group's exclusivity. Former members have described a high-control environment where questioning leadership is strongly discouraged, contact with outsiders is limited, and leaving the group is treated as a form of spiritual betrayal. Some ex-members have gone as far as labeling it a cult, citing emotional manipulation, and shunning practices directed at anyone who walks away. After Jacob Meyer passed away in 2010, leadership transferred within the organization, but the transition wasn't entirely smooth. Disputes over doctrine and authority led to fractures, with splinter groups forming their own congregations under similar names, but with slightly different theological positions. This is actually a recurring pattern across the broader sacred name movement. Once you make the argument that everyone else got the name wrong, it's only a matter of time before someone tells you that you're pronouncing it wrong too. The Assemblies of Yahweh remains active today, still headquartered in Bethel, Pennsylvania, and continues to publish literature and broadcast programming centered on the sacred name doctrine. They occupy a fascinating spot on the religious spectrum, too far outside mainstream Christianity for most churches to acknowledge, but too structured and scripture-focused for most people to dismiss outright. Gnosticism is one of the oldest and most persistently suppressed spiritual traditions in Western history, and once you understand its core claim, you'll see why mainstream religion wanted it gone. The central idea is deceptively simple. The God of the Old Testament, the creator of the physical world, is not the true God. He's a lower, flawed being called the demiurge, a kind of cosmic architect who either doesn't know or doesn't care that there's a higher, purely spiritual divine source above him. The material world he built isn't a gift, it's a prison. According to Gnostic belief, human beings contain a divine spark, a fragment of that true, higher God, trapped inside physical bodies within a universe designed to keep them ignorant. Salvation doesn't come through faith or obedience. It comes through gnosis, a Greek word meaning direct, personal knowledge of spiritual truth. You don't worship your way out, you learn your way out. This framework dates back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, developing alongside early Christianity. Prominent Gnostic teachers like Valentinus and Basilides built elaborate cosmologies describing chains of divine emanations called aeons that bridge the gap between the unknowable true God and the botched creation we inhabit. Some systems described 30 or more of these aeons arranged in pairs, with the demiurge emerging as the result of a cosmic error, often tied to an aeon named Sophia, whose curiosity or ambition caused a rupture in the divine order. The early church fathers absolutely despised this. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote an entire multi-volume work called Against Heresies, around 180 AD, specifically to dismantle Gnostic teachings. The problem for the church wasn't just theological disagreement. Gnosticism undermined the entire power structure. If salvation comes from inner knowledge rather than institutional authority, you don't need priests, you don't need churches, and you certainly don't need a pope. For centuries, almost everything we knew about Gnosticism came from the people trying to destroy it. That changed in 1945 when a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman discovered a sealed clay jar near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and a creation narrative called the Apocryphon of John. These had been buried, likely by monks from a nearby monastery, possibly to preserve them from church-ordered destruction. The texts revealed a tradition far more sophisticated than the church fathers had portrayed. The Gospel of Thomas contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many with no parallel in the New Testament, framing him not as a sacrificial savior, but as a teacher of hidden wisdom. One passage reads that the kingdom of God is inside you and all around you, not in buildings of wood and stone. Gnostic ideas didn't disappear after the early church stamped them out either. They resurfaced in the Cathars of medieval southern France, who believed the material world was evil and were massacred for it during the Albigensian Crusade. They echoed through the Mandeans of Iraq, who still exist today and revere John the Baptist while viewing Jesus with suspicion. Elements show up in Kabbalah, in certain Sufi traditions, and arguably in the philosophical underpinnings of The Matrix, which is not a coincidence since the Wachowskis were directly drawing on Gnostic imagery. The lasting appeal of Gnosticism is that it reframes the fundamental question of religion. Most traditions ask how you can serve or please God. Gnosticism asks why the world seems so fundamentally broken and answers that it was built that way, on purpose, by something that doesn't have your best interests in mind. The only way out is to wake up and remember what you actually are. Quimbanda operates as the shadow side of Brazilian spirituality, a tradition where practitioners work directly with spirits that most other religions try to keep at arm's length. While its sister religion Umbanda focuses on charity and light, Quimbanda deals in the practical matters that people actually need help with. Money problems, justice for wrongs committed against you, protection from enemies, and love that won't come naturally. The practice emerged from Bantu traditions brought by enslaved Africans to Brazil, blending with indigenous knowledge and bits of European folk magic over centuries. What sets it apart centers on its primary spirits, the Exus and Pombagiras. In Umbanda and Candomblé, these entities serve as messengers and tricksters. In Quimbanda, they become the main focus of worship and partnership. Exus appear as male spirits associated with crossroads, battlefields, and the streets. Pombagiras manifest as female spirits of the night, often depicted in red and black, connected to sexuality, independence, and feminine power. Both categories contain hundreds of individual spirits, each with specific domains and preferences. Exu Trancaruas guards the pathways. Maria Padilha commands one of the most powerful Pombagira lines. Exu Caveira works in graveyards with matters of death and endings. The rituals involve offerings placed at crossroads, in forests, or at cemetery gates. Practitioners leave cachaça, cigars, red candles, specific foods, and sometimes animal sacrifices depending on the working. The ceremonies happen late at night, accompanied by drumming and songs in Portuguese mixed with African languages. Possession occurs frequently, with spirits mounting their horses to speak, dance, drink, and conduct business with those seeking their help. Quimbanda gained a reputation as black magic or devil worship, particularly from Christian observers who saw the imagery of horned spirits and graveyard work as demonic. The tradition itself rejects this framing entirely. These spirits existed long before Christianity arrived in Brazil. They operate in morally gray territories because human life operates in morally gray territories. Someone stealing from you deserves consequences. Someone abusing their power needs to face justice. A person working magic against you requires magical defense. The practice demands payment. Spirits don't work for free, and practitioners maintain ongoing relationships with their exus and pambagiras through regular offerings and respect. Breaking promises to these entities brings swift and unpleasant consequences. The agreements function as binding contracts, not casual requests. Modern quimbanda houses operate throughout Brazil and increasingly in other countries with Brazilian diaspora communities. Each house maintains its own lineage of spirits and specific ways of working. Some incorporate more African elements, others blend in additional European ceremonial magic, and some develop entirely new approaches while maintaining the core relationships with exus and pombagiras. The tradition refuses to apologize for dealing in curse work, binding magic, and spiritual warfare. Life contains conflict, and pretending otherwise serves no practical purpose. Berber mythology is the ancient belief system of the Amazigh people, the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa who have been there for thousands of years before the arrival of Arabs, Romans, or even the Phoenicians. And despite centuries of pressure from Islam, Christianity, and colonial powers trying to erase it, fragments of this mythology have stubbornly survived in oral traditions, rituals, and rock art scattered across the Sahara. At the center of Berber cosmology sits a supreme god known by different names depending on the region. In many traditions, he's called Akuch or Yakuch, a sky deity who governs the universe but remains distant from human affairs. Below him exists a rich pantheon of spirits and supernatural beings that interact with the everyday world in very direct ways. One of the most fascinating figures is Anzar, the rain god. In parts of Morocco and Algeria, drought rituals dedicated to Anzar persisted well into the 20th century, and in some rural areas, arguably still do. The ceremony involved dressing a wooden ladle or spoon as a bride, parading it through the village, and singing songs asking Anzar to send rain to his bride. Villagers would splash water on each other during the procession. It's essentially a symbolic wedding between the community and a pre-Islamic deity, carried out openly in Muslim-majority regions for generations, because it worked just well enough, just often enough, that nobody wanted to be the one to stop doing it. The Berber spirit world is populated by entities called Jnun, which were later absorbed into Islamic tradition as jinn. But the original Berber conception was distinct. These spirits inhabited natural features like rivers, caves, mountains, and specific trees. Each location had its own resident spirit that needed to be respected or appeased. Disturbing a sacred spring without permission, for example, could result in illness, madness, or terrible luck. Then there's the figure of Tafukt, the sun, often treated as a feminine force in Berber tradition. The moon, Ayur, was masculine. This is the inverse of many Indo-European mythologies where the sun is male and the moon is female, and it shaped everything from agricultural calendars to marriage customs. The Amazigh also maintained a calendar system called the Yenayer that predates both the Islamic and Gregorian calendars. Its new year falls on January 12th or 13th, and it's still widely celebrated across North Africa today. The calendar counts from roughly 950 BCE, which Berber tradition holds as the year an Amazigh pharaoh named Shashank I defeated the Egyptian pharaoh and took the throne. So while much of the world rang in 2025, Amazigh communities were already in the year 2975. The real tragedy of Berber mythology is how much of it was lost. Because it was transmitted orally rather than written down, each generation that converted away from the old ways took irreplaceable knowledge with them. What survives today are pieces, echoes embedded in Amazigh tattoo symbolism, in the geometric patterns of their carpets, and in village rituals that locals will sometimes insist are just traditions, rather than religious practices. Whether that's genuine belief or a survival strategy developed over centuries of pressure to conform is something outsiders can only guess at. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, often shortened to the ELCA, is the largest Lutheran denomination in the United States, with roughly 3.5 million members. It traces its roots back to Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, when Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Germany, essentially telling the Catholic Church that selling forgiveness for cash was, to put it mildly, not great theology. The ELCA itself wasn't formally established until 1988, when 3 separate Lutheran bodies merged into one organization. But the real reason it shows up on an iceberg like this is because of how dramatically it has split from more traditional Lutheran churches worldwide. In 2009, the ELCA voted to allow openly gay and lesbian individuals in committed relationships to serve as clergy. This was a seismic shift, and it didn't come without consequences. Hundreds of congregations left the denomination in protest, with many joining or forming more conservative Lutheran bodies like the North American Lutheran Church. The fallout cost the ELCA an estimated 600,000 members over the following decade. The denomination also ordains women, supports access to reproductive health care, and has taken official stances on climate change and racial justice, putting it firmly on the progressive end of American Christianity. Critics within broader Lutheranism, particularly the more conservative Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod, view the ELCA as having abandoned core scriptural authority in favor of cultural relevance. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that Luther himself was a radical reformer who challenged religious authority, and that continuing to evolve is entirely in the spirit of the Reformation. It's a fascinating case of a major Christian denomination essentially choosing modernization over unity, and watching the membership numbers respond in real time. The National Alliance was, at its peak, considered the most dangerous and well-organized white nationalist group in the United States. It was founded in 1974 by William Luther Pierce, a former physics professor who left academia to pursue full-time political extremism, which is quite the career pivot. Pierce built the National Alliance not as a loose collection of angry people with pamphlets, but as a structured, ideologically driven organization modeled after a political party. Members paid dues, attended meetings, and were expected to follow a strict chain of command. The group operated out of a compound in Hillsborough, West Virginia, which served as its national headquarters for decades. What set Pierce apart from other fringe leaders was his ability to package his ideology into media. He authored The Turner Diaries under the pen name Andrew MacDonald, a novel depicting a violent overthrow of the federal government, followed by a worldwide ethnic cleansing campaign. The book became one of the most widely circulated texts in extremist circles, and was directly linked to inspiring real-world acts of domestic terrorism, most notably the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing carried out by Timothy McVeigh, who had pages of the novel on him when he was arrested. Pierce also wrote a second novel called Hunter, which depicted a lone wolf attacker targeting interracial couples, essentially a fictional instruction manual disguised as entertainment. Beyond publishing, the National Alliance owned Resistance Records, a music label that distributed white power rock and metal albums. This gave the group a direct pipeline into disaffected young people through music scenes and online distribution, long before social media radicalization became a mainstream concern. The organization also operated National Vanguard Books, a publishing house that sold extremist literature alongside selectively curated classical and philosophical texts, framing their ideology as part of a broader intellectual tradition rather than simple hatred. After Pierce passed away in 2002, the National Alliance rapidly fractured. Internal power struggles, financial mismanagement, and FBI infiltration gutted the organization within just a few years. Multiple splinter groups emerged, but none came close to replicating the infrastructure Pierce had built. The compound in West Virginia eventually fell into disrepair and was sold off. The National Alliance is often studied as a case example of how extremist movements can professionalize themselves using publishing, music, structured membership, and media outreach to build something far more resilient than a typical hate group. Its collapse after the loss of a single charismatic leader also demonstrates how fragile those structures can be when they're built around one person's vision. The African Orthodox Church is not what most people picture when they hear the word Orthodox. Founded in 1921 by George Alexander Maguire, a former Episcopal priest from Antigua, this church emerged directly out of the Marcus Garvey movement and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Maguire had a vision, an independent black church that carried the full weight and liturgical tradition of apostolic Christianity, but completely free from white ecclesiastical control. Maguire was consecrated as a bishop by a line of clergy connected to the Old Catholic movement, which gave the church a claim to apostolic succession. essentially an unbroken chain of ordination stretching back to the original apostles. That detail matters because it meant the African Orthodox Church wasn't just starting fresh. It was asserting that black Christians had every right to the oldest, most established forms of Christian authority without needing permission from Rome or Canterbury or anyone else. The theology itself blended traditional Orthodox and Catholic liturgical practices with a distinctly Afrocentric worldview. Maguire famously encouraged his congregation to forget the white gods and envision the divine in their own image. Church iconography depicted a black Madonna and child, and the broader message was that Christianity had deep African roots long before European colonization reshaped it. The church spread across the United States, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, particularly gaining traction in Uganda and Kenya during the 1930s. In East Africa, it became intertwined with anti-colonial resistance, giving local communities a spiritual framework that didn't come packaged with European imperial authority. Over the decades, various branches sought and sometimes obtained recognition from established Eastern Orthodox patriarchates, while others maintained full independence. This created a somewhat fragmented landscape where different congregations might lean more traditionally Orthodox or more Afrocentric depending on their leadership. Today, the African Orthodox Church remains a relatively small but historically significant institution. It sits at this fascinating crossroads of Pan-Africanism, liturgical Christianity, and anti-colonial theology, a church that essentially said the oldest traditions of the faith already belonged to Africa, and it was time to take them back. Epsilon Program operates as a fictional religious movement that has transcended its digital origins to influence real-world discussions about cult psychology and media manipulation. Created for Grand Theft Auto V, this satirical organization presents a disturbingly accurate mirror of actual high-control groups. The program centers around Chris Formage, a charismatic leader who preaches salvation through monetary donation and unwavering faith in extraterrestrial guidance. Members, known as Epsilonists, follow a complex mythology involving alien ancestors, dimensional travel, and the promise of ascending to a higher plane of existence called Craft. What sets Epsilon apart from typical video game factions is its methodical adoption of real cult recruitment tactics. The organization demands progressively larger financial contributions, isolates members from outside influences, and employs thought-stopping techniques through repetitive mantras and meditation practices. Members wear distinctive light blue robes and are required to abstain from technology, alcohol, and material possessions, while paradoxically funding the leader's lavish lifestyle. The program's documentation includes detailed theological texts, member testimonials, and recruitment materials that closely parallel those used by established movements like Scientology and Heaven's Gate. Rockstar Games consulted with cult researchers during development, resulting in an unsettlingly authentic portrayal of indoctrination processes. Beyond its gaming context, Epsilon has spawned genuine online communities where participants engage with the fictional belief system. Some members have organized real-world meetups, created elaborate fan theories extending the mythology, and even established websites promoting Epsilon teachings as legitimate spiritual guidance. The phenomenon demonstrates how fictional narratives can serve as psychological testing grounds, allowing people to explore cult dynamics without real-world consequences while simultaneously revealing their susceptibility to authoritarian influence structures. Rainbow gatherings are massive, informal outdoor events where thousands of people temporarily build a functioning community in national forests across the United States and increasingly around the world. No leaders, no organizers, no admission fees, and technically, no rules. The gatherings operate on a principle called voluntary cooperation, where everything from cooking meals to digging latrines is handled by whoever feels like stepping up. The movement traces back to 1972, when a loose network of counterculture figures, Vietnam War protesters, and spiritual seekers organized the first gathering in Colorado's Roosevelt National Forest. Around 20,000 people showed up. Since then, a national gathering has taken place every single year, always on public land, always timed to culminate around the 4th of July with a mass silent meditation for world peace. Now, the Rainbow Family of Living Light, as they formally call themselves, insists they are not an organization. There are no membership roles, no dues, no hierarchy. Anyone who shows up is considered part of the family. Decisions are made through open councils where anyone can speak, and nothing moves forward until the group reaches full consensus. In theory, this sounds like a utopian experiment. In practice, it gets complicated fast. The gatherings have drawn consistent friction with the U.S. Forest Service, which requires permits for large groups on public land. The Rainbow family has historically refused to obtain permits, arguing that the First Amendment protects their right to peaceably assemble and that no single person has the authority to sign on behalf of a leaderless group. This legal gray area has led to decades of standoffs, citations, and court cases, with mixed results on both sides. Inside the gatherings themselves, the culture revolves around sharing. Kitchens are set up by various camps and feed everyone for free. The preferred currency is literally nothing. If someone offers you something and you try to pay, you'll probably get a lecture. The phrase "we love you" is used as a greeting between strangers, which is either deeply heartwarming or mildly unsettling depending on your tolerance for that sort of thing. But the lack of formal structure has a darker side. With no security force and no vetting process, the gatherings have historically attracted individuals with predatory intentions, alongside the genuine peace seekers. Reports of theft, substance-fueled altercations, and more serious offenses have followed the events for decades. A camp known as A Camp, which forms at the entrance of most gatherings, has developed a reputation as a particularly chaotic zone where heavy alcohol use concentrates, since alcohol is discouraged deeper within the gathering but not formally banned. Law enforcement perspectives on rainbow gatherings range from cautious tolerance to outright hostility. Some officers have described them as environmental disasters, pointing to soil erosion, water contamination, and damage to wildlife habitats. Supporters counter that the family conducts extensive cleanup operations after each gathering and often leaves sites in better condition than they found them. The spiritual dimension is eclectic to say the least. You'll find elements of Buddhism, Christianity, Native American traditions, Hinduism, paganism, and a dozen other belief systems all blended together in a way that purists from any of those traditions would probably find questionable. The central ritual, that mass silence on July 4th followed by collective chanting, is treated as the spiritual core of the whole event, a moment where thousands of people genuinely believe they are channeling unified intention toward healing the planet. Whether rainbow gatherings are a beautiful expression of anarchist community building or a cautionary tale about what happens when you remove all institutional accountability probably depends on which 3 days of the gathering you happen to attend. The Evangelical Orthodox Church began as a group of former Campus Crusade for Christ leaders in the late 1960s who became convinced that mainstream Protestantism had drifted too far from the original Christian church. Led by figures like Peter Gilchrist and John Braun, they formed a community called the New Covenant Apostolic Order, which eventually rebranded several times before settling on the Evangelical Orthodox Church in 1979. Their central mission was essentially to reverse engineer Christianity. They studied the early church fathers, adopted liturgical worship, episcopal hierarchy, and sacramental theology, essentially building an Orthodox church from scratch without any actual connection to historical orthodoxy. They ordained their own bishops, established parishes across North America, and operated for years as a self-constructed ancient church. The twist came in 1987, when the majority of the group, around 2,000 members and nearly 20 parishes, were formally received into the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America. Decades of independent searching had led them right back to one of the oldest institutional churches in existence. Not everyone made the jump, though. A smaller faction refused to join the Antiochians and continued operating independently under the Evangelical Orthodox Church name. This remnant group persisted with far less visibility, maintaining their own bishops and parishes while existing in a kind of ecclesiastical no-man's land, not quite Protestant, not recognized by mainstream orthodoxy, and largely forgotten by the broader Christian world. The larger story is often held up as either an inspiring example of genuine theological seeking or a cautionary tale about what happens when a group of charismatic leaders decide they can reconstruct an entire ancient tradition on their own terms. Soldiers of Heaven, or Jund al-Sama in Arabic, was a messianic cult that operated in Iraq during the mid-2000s, and their story ended in one of the strangest battles of the entire Iraq War. The group was founded by a man named Ahmad al-Hassani, who claimed to be in direct contact with the Mahdi, the prophesied Redeemer in Islamic eschatology. Some accounts go further, suggesting al-Hassani claimed to actually be the Mahdi himself, or at minimum his representative on Earth. He gathered a following that blended Shia Islamic beliefs with apocalyptic prophecy, convincing his followers that the end times were imminent and that they had a divine role to play in triggering them. Their plan was breathtaking in its ambition and borderline incomprehensible in its logic. During the Ashura pilgrimage in January of 2007, when millions of Shia Muslims gathered in the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, the soldiers of heaven intended to launch a massive armed assault on the shrines and religious leadership. The goal was to assassinate Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, one of the most revered Shia clerics alive, along with other senior religious figures. They believed this act of chaos would somehow accelerate the return of the Mahdi and usher in a new divine age. They had amassed a surprisingly large fighting force, estimated at anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 armed members, and had set up a fortified camp in orchards and farmland near Najaf. They stockpiled weapons, dug trenches, and genuinely prepared for what they saw as a holy final battle. Iraqi security forces caught wind of the plot just before it could be carried out. What followed was the Battle of Najaf, a brutal engagement that lasted roughly 2 days. Iraqi army units, backed by American air support including helicopter gunships and fixed-wing aircraft, assaulted the cult's positions. The fighting was far more intense than anyone expected. The soldiers of heaven fought with the kind of fanatical commitment you only see from people who truly believe they are fulfilling a divine prophecy. By the time it was over, estimates suggest somewhere between 200 and 400 cult members were killed, with dozens more captured. Iraqi forces also suffered significant casualties, making it one of the deadliest engagements Iraqi troops had faced up to that point. What makes the soldiers of heaven so unsettling in hindsight is how little warning there was. A large apocalyptic militia had organized, armed itself, and nearly carried out a catastrophic attack on one of the holiest events in Shia Islam, and almost nobody saw it coming until the last possible moment. The Ahmadi religion of peace and light emerged in 2019 out of Iraq, founded by a man named Abdullah Hashem Abba al-Sadiq, who claims to be the successor to every major religious figure you can think of. We're talking the return of Jesus, the Islamic Mahdi, the successor to the Buddha, an avatar of Vishnu, all rolled into one guy. If that sounds like an ambitious resume, that's because it is. The group positions itself as a universal faith, pulling from Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and more, stitching them together under the idea that all religions were originally one truth that got fragmented over time. Abdullah Hashem claims to receive direct divine communication and says he was appointed by Imam Ahmad al-Hassan, a controversial Iraqi cleric who declared himself the successor to the hidden 12th Imam in Shia Islam back in the early 2000s. So this is essentially a splinter movement of an already fringe messianic claim. What draws people in is the group's heavy online presence. They run slick social media campaigns, professional-looking YouTube content, and actively recruit across multiple languages. Their messaging targets people who feel disillusioned with mainstream religion, offering this idea of a unified spiritual truth that transcends denominational lines. It sounds appealing on the surface, but former members and cult researchers have raised serious red flags. Ex-followers describe an environment of extreme control, where questioning leadership is treated as spiritual failure. Members are allegedly encouraged to cut ties with family and friends outside the group, donate significant portions of their income, and submit completely to the authority of Abdullah Hashem. The group has also been accused of manipulating vulnerable individuals, particularly young people searching for meaning online. Several families across Europe, North America, and the Middle East have spoken publicly about losing loved ones to the organization, describing how their family members became increasingly isolated and unrecognizable after joining. Despite branding itself with words like peace and light, the organization checks a striking number of boxes on cult identification frameworks, a singular charismatic leader claiming divine authority, isolation from outside relationships, financial exploitation, and an us versus them worldview where anyone outside the group is spiritually lost. Religious scholars from both Sunni and Shia traditions have formally denounced the movement, and it remains banned or heavily monitored in several countries. Kabbology is one of the internet's earliest parody religions, and it predates the World Wide Web as most people know it. Back in the early 1990s, a man named James Kibo Perry became one of the most recognizable figures on Usenet, which was essentially a massive collection of discussion forums that served as the internet's social hub before websites even existed. Kibo had a peculiar habit. He would search the entirety of Usenet for any mention of his name, and then personally reply to those posts. Keep in mind, this was an era where most people online were academics and tech enthusiasts, so having some guy magically appear every time you typed 5 letters felt almost supernatural. This led to the creation of a dedicated Usenet group called alt.religion.kybology, where followers, known as kybologists, developed an elaborate mythology around Kibo as a sort of omniscient digital deity. They created doctrines, held mock theological debates, and engaged in absurdist humor that would later become the blueprint for internet culture as we know it. The religion had its own rival faction too. A competing group formed around a user called Shibo, leading to flame wars that mirrored real sectarian conflicts, but were entirely about who could be the most creatively ridiculous. What separates Kabbology from a simple inside joke is its staying power and genuine community structure. It functioned as a proto-meme religion decades before anyone used the word meme casually, predating things like the Church of the Subgenius's online presence and the Flying Spaghetti Monster by years. Kibo himself is still around, occasionally popping up online, which to the faithful only confirms what they always suspected. You can never truly escape Kibo. He will find you. Landover Baptist Church is a satirical website that has been fooling people on the internet since 1998, and honestly, the fact that it still catches people off guard says a lot about the state of online discourse. The site presents itself as the online home of a fundamentalist Baptist megachurch based in Freehold, Iowa, a town that does not exist. Every piece of content on the site is deliberately crafted to be just barely beyond the threshold of what an actual extremist church might say, which is exactly why it works so well. The church's fictional pastor, Pastor Deacon Fred, presides over a congregation that claims to be true Christians, while condemning essentially everything in modern society. We're talking about articles declaring that certain vegetables are sinful, that specific children's cartoons are tools of the devil, and that unsaved people are not welcome on the church property. The site even has a fake online store selling absurd merchandise and a members-only section for platinum tithers who donate enough money. The real creator behind Landover Baptist is Chris Harper, who launched the site as a response to what he saw as genuine extremism within certain fundamentalist communities. The brilliance of the project is that it operates entirely through Poe's law, the internet principle that states without a clear indicator of intent, it is impossible to distinguish a parody of extreme views from the real thing. And Landover has tested that law repeatedly. The site has been cited as a real church by actual news outlets and angry commenters alike. Forum threads and social media posts have gone viral with people expressing outrage over Landover's latest article, completely unaware that they are reacting to satire. In some cases, real fundamentalist groups have even agreed with positions the site posted as jokes. The site also operates a forum called Landover Baptist Church Forum, where users roleplay as members of the congregation, staying in character while discussing current events through the lens of absurd religious conservatism. This community aspect turned it into something more than just a website. It became a long-running collaborative performance piece. Landover Baptist sits in an interesting spot on this iceberg, because while it is entirely fictional, it has arguably done more to document and expose the rhetorical patterns of religious extremism than most serious journalism on the subject. By mimicking the tone, structure, and logic of genuine fundamentalist rhetoric so precisely, it ended up serving as a mirror that made real extreme positions harder to hide behind respectability. Last Thursdayism is the philosophical thought experiment that proposes the entire universe was created last Thursday, complete with all of your memories, every fossil in the ground, every historical record, and even the light from distant stars already in transit. Everything you think happened before last Thursday was simply placed there at the moment of creation to make it look like the universe is billions of years old. Now, the obvious response is to call this absurd. And it is. That's kind of the point. Last Thursdayism isn't really a belief system anyone holds sincerely. It emerged as a reductio ad absurdum, a logical tool designed to expose a flaw in a very specific type of argument. It directly parodies a real theological concept called omphalos hypothesis, put forward by Philip Gauss in 1857. Gauss argued that God created the earth with the appearance of age built in, that Adam had a belly button despite never being born, that trees in the Garden of Eden had growth rings despite never actually growing. His idea was meant to reconcile a literal reading of Genesis with the growing geological evidence that the earth was far older than a few thousand years. Last Thursdayism takes that same logic and cranks it to its most extreme conclusion. If God can fake billions of years of history, why not fake everything before last Thursday? Or 5 minutes ago? The argument is structurally identical. There is no observable test you could run to disprove it, because any evidence against it would have also been created last Thursday. This makes it what philosophers call an unfalsifiable claim. It can't be proven wrong, but that's not a strength. It's actually the biggest red flag in epistemology. If your theory explains everything equally well no matter what happens, it effectively explains nothing. The reason last Thursdayism keeps showing up in philosophical and theological debates is because it forces a very uncomfortable question. If you accept that the universe could have been created with a false history baked in, you've essentially abandoned the idea that physical evidence means anything at all. And once you do that, you don't really have a foundation left to build any knowledge on. It's a thought experiment with no followers, no churches, and no scriptures. But it's quietly one of the most effective arguments in the philosophy of religion. Not because it's true, but because it dares you to explain why it isn't. Tarvoism is, according to its own website, one of the oldest and largest religions in the world, boasting over 1 billion followers across more than 150 countries. Its central figure, Tarvu, supposedly arrived on Earth around 3,000 years ago as a tiny baby boy weighing just 3 pounds 4 ounces, landing in the ocean where he was adopted and raised by Ubu, a holy octopus. At age 9, Tarvu swam ashore to live among humanity, and at 21, he revealed himself as the true deity at his own birthday party. This event, known as the Unveiling of Tarvu, is celebrated annually on December 25th as Tarvu's Day. The faith has an impressively detailed mythology. Tarvu created 2 universes, Universe A and Universe B. We live in Universe B, and every person has an invisible guardian from Universe A watching over them. Octopuses are considered sacred animals. Owls are also holy, but not as holy as octopuses. Eating calamari in any form is strictly forbidden, and so is drinking sparkling water, because the bubbles can supposedly spell out blasphemous phrases in Octish, the language of octopuses. Tarvois temples are called chabernacles, and followers attend every Tuesday, which they call Tarvis Day, and Thursday, known as Tharvis Day. On 2 holy days each week, practitioners eat exclusively orange-colored food like carrots, cheddar cheese, and sweet potatoes. Their holy book is called the Tarvunti, and the core teaching of the entire religion can be summed up in 2 words: be nice. The whole thing is, of course, completely fabricated. Tarvoism was created in 2008 by British comedians Peter Serafinowicz and Robert Popper, the same duo behind the beloved BBC parody series Look Around You. They built out an entire website, a full wiki encyclopedia called Tarvopedia, promotional videos, and layers upon layers of absurdly specific lore, all designed to mimic the tone and structure of a real religious organization's online presence. The greeting among Tarvoists is simply, Hebo, and their recruitment pitch is, it's so easy to join. All you have to do is recite a short, entirely nonsensical prayer. The genius of Tarvoism is that it doesn't target any single religion. It parodies the entire concept of organized faith by replicating every familiar element, the origin myth, the dietary restrictions, the holy texts, the temples, the holidays, and then fills them all with the most absurd content possible. It's a satire so thorough that it circles back around to being oddly charming. The project gained enough traction that HBO reportedly signed Serafinowicz and Popper to develop a sitcom based on the religion, though that series never materialized. Still, Tarvuism remains one of the most elaborate parody religions ever constructed, a fully realized fake faith built entirely to prove that the scaffolding of belief systems can make almost anything sound convincing.